The Wyoming wind carried winter's first snow across the open plains, whipping between the skeletal trees that dotted the landscape. Cold and unforgiving, that it howled through the bones of what had once been a prosperous trading post, now reduced to crooked stalls leaning against each other like drunks at closing time. Jackson Harlow's breath fogged before him as he tracked boot prints through the fresh powder. His quarry, a horse thief with $1,000 bounty, had fled north along the Colorado-Wyoming border, where lawlessness reigned and men disappeared like smoke. At 42, Jackson was too old for this work, but grief had a way of making a man forget his age, trading wisdom for recklessness. He adjusted the worn hat that shadowed his weather-beaten face, ice crystals forming in his salt and pepper beard. 5 years of hunting had carved deep lines around his eyes, eyes that had once sparkled with hope, but now reflected only determination and ghosts. The trail ended abruptly at a ravine. Jackson cursed under his breath. The thief had doubled back, likely heading toward the trading post he'd passed an hour earlier. Another day, another chase prolonged. He turned his horse around, the animal's breath billowing white in the frigid air. Gunshots cracked through the gathering dusk as Jackson approached the trading post. Not unusual in these parts, but these sounds carried something different, fear and laughter that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He dismounted, tethered his horse behind a dilapidated shed, and moved forward on foot, hand resting on his Colt revolver. The sight that greeted him turned his blood cold, despite his years of witnessing mankind's capacity for cruelty. Under flickering torchlight, a crowd had gathered around a makeshift auction block. A man in a stained coat banged a gavel against a wooden crate, his voice carrying over the biting wind. "Next lot, woman fit for cleaning or cooking. Comes with 2 dependents. Quiet stock, starting at $10. On the platform stood a woman, head bowed, wrists bound with rope that had rubbed her skin raw. Her long, dark hair hung like a curtain, obscuring her face. A threadbare shawl offered little protection against the cold. Behind her huddled a small girl no older than 4, clutching a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a man's old coat. $5, a voice called from the crowd, followed by cruel laughter. I'll pay 5 just to shut her up. Jackson's jaw tightened. He'd seen slave trading before, illegal but persistent in these forgotten corners, where law was merely a suggestion. Usually he minded his business. Bounty hunting required a certain detachment, a focus on the job at hand. But something about this scene, perhaps the small girl's defiant stance despite her trembling, made him pause. As if sensing his presence, the child looked up. Her eyes, wide and clear, even in the dimming light, locked onto his. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, clutching her bundle tighter. "Can you buy us, mister?" Her voice was surprisingly steady, a whisper that somehow carried over the wind. "Please, we won't be trouble." Jackson felt the world slow around him. The child's eyes, there was something hauntingly familiar in them, something that reached into the past and clutched at a heart he thought long hardened. For a moment he saw another pair of eyes. Eleanor's eyes, warm brown with flecks of gold, eyes he'd memorized and mourned for 5 long years. $10, called another voice, pulling Jackson from his trance. Without fully understanding why, Jackson stepped forward. 15 yuan, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieter gathering. The auctioneer grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. $15 for the lot. Do I hear 20? A burly man near the front raised a hand. 20. 25. Jackson countered, immediately as surprising himself. The crowd parted slightly, allowing the auctioneer a better view of this newcomer. Jackson knew how he appeared, trail-worn, coat badge-shaped tan line on his chest, where a star had once rested, eyes that had seen too much. A former lawman turned bounty hunter, the kind of man you didn't cross unless you were willing to die for the principle. 30, called the burly man, though with less conviction. 35, Jackson said, his voice calm but cold as the gathering snow. A silence fell. The auctioneer's gavel struck with finality. Sold to the gentleman in the back. Cash only, sir. Jackson approached the platform, counting out bills from a leather pouch. The transaction was quick and personal. The woman never looked up even as the rope was untied from the post and handed to Jackson like a leash. The little girl moved immediately to his side, still clutching her bundle. Now that he was closer, Jackson could see it was an infant sleeping despite the cold and commotion. "Come on," he said quietly, not to the woman but to the child who seemed more responsive. "My horse is this way." They walked in silence through the now falling snow away from the trading post and its flickering torches. The woman stumbled behind her steps uncertain. The little girl matched Jackson stride for stride, her tiny boots leaving impressions alongside his larger ones. At the edge of the camp, beneath a frost-stiffened pean, Jackson stopped. He needed to see who he had just purchased. 5 years as a bounty hunter had taught him to trust no one, and the familiar ache in his chest was making him reckless. "Ma'am," he said quietly, turning to face the woman who still hadn't uttered a word. "I need to see who I'm taking with me." She hesitated, shoulders tensing beneath a thin shawl. Then slowly she lifted her head. The fading light caught her features all at once, high cheekbones, a small scar at the corner of her mouth and eyes. Those eyes brown with flecks of gold, now dulled by years of suffering, but unmistakable. Jackson staggered back as if struck. The world tilted beneath his boots. Eleanor. The name escaped him like a prayer when he'd whispered to the darkness for 5 years, never expecting an answer. The woman's eyes widened in momentary recognition before shuddering again. She took a step back, clutching the child's shoulder protectively. "My name is Mary," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Mary Wilson. This is Lily, and the baby is David." But Jackson wasn't listening. He was reaching into his coat pocket, fingers closing around a charred piece of fabric, all that remained of the handkerchief he'd given Eleanor before the fire that had supposedly claimed her life. He'd kept it these 5 years, a talisman of grief, a reminder of his failure to protect her. "You're dead," he whispered more to himself than to her. "They found bones. They told me you burned in that boarding house fire." The woman called Mary flinched at the word fire, her gaze darting to the little girl beside her. "You're mistaken, sir. Please, it's getting colder. The children need shelter." Jackson stood frozen, the past and present, colliding like a winter storm against a mountainside. The rational part of him, the part that had kept him alive as a bounty hunter, knew he should press harder, demand answers. But the little girl was shivering now, and the bundle in her arms had begun to whimper. "We have a long ride," he said finally, his voice rough. "Can you sit a horse?" Mary nodded, her eyes still avoiding his. Jackson helped them onto his gelding, mounting behind them. The woman held the baby now, while the little girl Lily sat in front, Jackson's arms encircling her as he held the reins. She leaned back against him without hesitation, a trust he'd done nothing to earn. As they rode through the deepening night, snow falling like ashes around them, Jackson's mind raced. Either he was losing his sanity, seeing the ghost of his lost love in a stranger's face, or the impossible had happened. Either way, he had just tied his fate to that of a woman and 2 children he knew nothing about in a land where such attachments could be deadly. The miles passed in silence, broken only by the sound of hooves against snow and the occasional whisper of Mary to the infant in her arms. Lily had fallen asleep against Jackson's chest, her small body warm despite the cold. It was in this moment of stillness, with the child's weight against him and the stars appearing between breaks in the clouds, that Jackson felt something shift within his hardened heart. Whether this woman was Eleanor or a stranger with her face, whether these children were a burden or a blessing, he had made a choice tonight. And in a life of regrets and roads not taken, perhaps this choice could lead somewhere other than sorrow. His cabin appeared as a dark silhouette against the night sky, smoke still rising from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before leaving that morning. A humble structure built more for function than comfort, it had been his solitary refuge these past years. Now as he approached with 3 additional souls in tow, it seemed both smaller and somehow more significant, no longer just a place to rest between hunts, but a shelter for those who needed it more than he. The woman called Mary gazed at the cabin with what might have been relief or apprehension. Jackson couldn't tell. But as he helped her down from the horse, their eyes met briefly, and in that moment a flicker of something passed between them. Recognition. Fear, hope, whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Jackson with the same question that had haunted him since the auction block. Who was this woman really, and why did she wear the face of a ghost? The cabin's interior was sparse but functional, a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a single bed in the corner, and a small shelf of books that seemed out of place among the practical implements of survival. A collection of wanted posters was tacked to one wall, and a rifle hung within easy reach of the door. Jackson stoked the dying embers, adding logs, until flames leapt up, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Mary stood near the door, still holding David, while Lily explored the small space with curious eyes. "There's only one bed," Jackson said, awkward in a way he hadn't been for years. "You and the children can take it. I'll sleep by the fire." Mary nodded, her movements cautious, as she settled on the edge of the bed, cradling David. Lily climbed up beside her, but her eyes remained on Jackson, studying him with an intensity that unnerved him. He busied himself preparing a simple meal, beans and jerky heated over the fire. Not much, but better than nothing. When he offered a plate to Mary, she accepted it with a murmured, "Thank you," her fingers careful not to touch his. They ate in silence. Jackson noticed how Mary cut Lily's food into small pieces, how she tested the temperature, before letting the child eat, how her own portion remained largely untouched. Maternal instincts, certainly, but there was something more, a vigilance, a wariness, that spoke of hard lessons learned. After the meal, Jackson cleared the dishes, then fetched water from the barrel outside. He heated some in a pot over the fire and offered it to Mary for washing. "There are our clean clothes in that trunk," he said, pointing to a wooden chest near the bed. "My sister sent them for a niece who never visited. Might fit the girl." Mary looked surprised at this small kindness. "Thank you," she said again, her voice still barely above a whisper. Jackson nodded, then stepped outside to tend to his horse and give them privacy. The night had grown colder, the snow falling steadily now. He stood in the darkness, breath fogging before him, and tried to make sense of the evening's events. 5 years ago, Eleanor Fisher had been his future, his promise of something beyond the badge he wore, Brown. A school teacher with dreams bigger than the small Colorado town where they'd met. She'd awakened in him hopes he'd long forgotten. They were to be married that spring. Then came the fire at the boarding house where she lived, a blaze that had consumed the entire structure in minutes. They'd found bone fragments, told him no one could have survived. He'd buried an empty coffin, and with it, his heart. Now a woman with Eleanor's face, Eleanor's eyes, sat in his cabin. A woman who called herself Mary Wilson and flinched at the mention of fire. A woman with a child who looked to be about 4 years old, conceived around the time Eleanor had disappeared. Could it be possible, or was grief finally driving him to madness? When Jackson returned to the cabin, Mary was sitting on the bed, David asleep beside her, wrapped in fresh blankets. Lily wore a nightgown several sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up to free her hands. She was drawing with a piece of charcoal on scrap paper Jackson had forgotten he possessed. Mary had changed too, into a simple dress that must have been among the clothes in the trunk. With her face freshly washed and her hair combed, the resemblance to Eleanor was even more striking. She looked up as he entered, then quickly away, as if the sight of him caused her pain. "You should get some rest," Jackson said, arranging his bedroll near the fire. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Mary nodded, lying down beside the children, her body curled protectively around them. Jackson settled on his makeshift bed, his back to the fire, facing the door out of habit, always ready for trouble. Sleep eluded him. He listened to the soft breathing of the children, the occasional crackle of the fire, the wind whistling through the small gaps in the cabin walls. And he remembered Eleanor's laugh, the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was thinking how her eyes would light up when she spoke of the future. If this woman was Eleanor, why would she deny it, what had happened in those 5 years? And if she wasn't, if this was some cruel trick of fate, a coincidence beyond comprehension, what was he to do with a woman and two children in a land that devoured the weak? Morning arrived, with reluctant light filtering through the cabin's single window. Jackson woke instantly, a habit from years of sleeping with one eye open. Mary was already up tending to the fire with practiced movements. David lay awake in the center of the bed, kicking small feet in the air, while Lily still slept. "You're up early," Jackson said, his voice rough from sleep. Mary startled slightly, turning to face him. "Force of habit," she replied, her voice still soft but more present than it had been the night before. "I hope I didn't wake you." Jackson shook his head, rising to his feet. "Coffee, please." This simple exchange, ordinary domestic, felt surreal after years of solitude. Jackson measured coffee grounds into a pot, adding water from the kettle Mary had already heated. As it brewed over the fire, a fragrant steam filled the cabin, momentarily masking the tension that stretched between them. "Your daughter," Jackson said carefully, watching Mary's face. "Lily, she's what, 4 years old?" Mary's hand stilled. "Nearly 5, she answered after a pause. "Born in '82, then." Mary nodded, her eyes on David rather than Jackson. "The fire at Willow Creek boarding house was in January of '81. Jackson continued, keeping his voice neutral despite the hammering of his heart. "Eleanor Fisher was declared dead on January 18th, 1881. Wishing at the name, Mary's shoulders tensed, but her face remained impassive. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Harlow." "Are you—" The question hung in the air between them. "Because you have her eyes, Mary. You have Eleanor's eyes, her voice, even the small scar at the corner of her mouth where she fell from a horse as a child." Mary turned away, busying herself with straightening blankets that didn't need straightening. "Many people share similar features. It's a coincidence, nothing more." "I don't believe in coincidences," Jackson said. "Not like this." Before Mary could respond, Lily stirred, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. The conversation halted as the child climbed from the bed and padded across the floor to her mother, leaning against her leg sleepily. "Good morning, sweetheart," Mary said, her voice softening as she stroked Lily's tangled hair. "Are you hungry?" Lily nodded, then turned curious eyes to Jackson. "Do you have any books?" she asked unexpectedly. The question caught Jackson off guard. "A few, he admitted, gesturing to the small shelf. "Nothing for children, though." "That's all right," Lily said with the seriousness of a much older soul. "I can read grown-up books, too. Mama taught me." Mary's face showed a flicker of what might have been pride before it disappeared behind her careful mask. "Let the man have his breakfast first, Lily." Jackson poured coffee for himself and Mary, then set about preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of his molasses. As they ate, he observed Lily's mannerisms, the way she folded the corner of her napkin, just so how she hummed a soft tune between bites. Small gestures that stirred memories. Eleanor used to fold napkins that exact same way. After breakfast, while Mary tended to David, Lily wandered to the bookshelf. She ran small fingers along the spines, pulling out a volume at random, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets Jackson had carried with him for years, its pages dog-eared and worn. To his surprise, Lily opened it and began to read aloud, her young voice carefully enunciating words far beyond her years. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." Jackson froze coffee cup halfway to his lips. Those words, they were from Eleanor's favorite sonnet, the one she'd recited to him the night he'd proposed. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Lily looked up, startled. "Mama reads it to me sometimes," she said, "when I can't sleep." Jackson's gaze shifted to Mary, who stood with her back to them, shoulders rigid. "Does she now?" he said quietly. The day passed in a strange rhythm of awkward silences and careful navigation of the small space. Jackson repaired a broken chair, split more firewood, and checked his traps. Ordinary tasks made extraordinary by the presence of others in his solitary world. Mary kept busy with the children, speaking little but watching everything with those haunting eyes. By late afternoon, snow was falling again, thicker this time, blanketing the world in white silence. Jackson stood at the window, watching the approach of a lone rider through the swirling flakes. "Someone's coming," he said, reaching for his rifle out of habit. Mary immediately gathered Lily to her side, fear evident in her posture. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice tight. Jackson squinted through the frost-edged glass. "Sheriff Calloway," he identified, recognizing the distinctive silhouette of his occasional ally. "No cause for alarm. He's one of the few honest lawmen in these parts." But Mary didn't seem reassured. She retreated to the far corner of the cabin, David in her arms, Lily pressed against her side. The fear in her eyes was too raw, too real to be an act. Sheriff Calloway stamped snow from his boots before entering, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of horse and leather. A tall man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, he nodded to Jackson before his gaze settled on the woman and children in the corner. "Didn't know you had company, Harlow," he said, removing his hat. "Ma'am," he added with a respectful nod to Mary. "What brings you out in this weather, Sheriff?" Jackson asked, setting his rifle aside but keeping it within reach, another habit. Calloway accepted the coffee Jackson offered, warming his hands around the cup. "Trouble brewing," he said simply. "Thought you should know, given your profession." Mary's eyes darted between the two men, her arms tightening around David. "What kind of trouble?" Jackson asked. "Marcus Blackwood's in town." Calloway said the name, landing like a stone in the quiet cabin. "Seems he's looking for some stolen property, a woman and two children who disappeared from his estate last week." Jackson felt, rather than saw, Mary's reaction, a sharp intake of breath, quickly stifled. "Blackwood?" He repeated the name, bitter on his tongue. "Thought he stayed in Denver these days, letting his hired guns do the dirty work." "Normally, yes, but he's taking this personally, offering a substantial reward for information." Calloway's eyes flickered to Mary again. "I'm not asking questions, Harlow. Just thought you should know. Blackwood owns half the county officials and most of the marshals in these parts." "Appreciate the warning," Jackson said. "How long's he planning to stay?" "Hard to say. He's set up at the Grand Hotel, brought a small army with him." Calloway finished his coffee, then rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "Whatever you're involved in, be careful. Blackwood's not a man who forgives being crossed." After the sheriff left, silence fell over the cabin. Jackson turned to Mary, who stood pale and still as a statue, her eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. "You want to tell me what that was about?" he asked quietly. Mary swallowed hard. "We should leave," she whispered. "Tonight, he'll find us." "Who will Blackwood?" Jackson stepped closer, keeping his voice low so as not to frighten the children. "Was he the one who had you at that auction?" Mary shook her head, her gaze darting to the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "Not directly, but his men. They'll be looking. We've already stayed too long." "I can't take you anywhere in this storm," Jackson said, gesturing to the window where snow now fell in blinding sheets. "We'd freeze before we made 10 miles. "Then we'll die free," Mary said with sudden fierceness, surprising him. "Better that than what awaits if he finds us." The vehemence in her voice, the desperation, told Jackson more than her words. Whatever Mary had endured, whoever she really was, her fear of Marcus Blackwood was genuine. "No one's doing," he said firmly, "and no one's taking you or these children anywhere you don't want to go. Not while I'm breathing." The promise escaped him before he could consider its implications. 5 years of looking out for no one but himself, and now he was pledging protection to a woman who might be a stranger, and children who were certainly not his responsibility. Or were they? The thought whispered through his mind as he watched Lily comfort her mother, small hands patting Mary's arm. If Mary was Eleanor, if she had been pregnant when she disappeared, then Lily could be. The possibility was too overwhelming to contemplate. "We'll stay put until the storm passes," Jackson decided. Then we'll figure out our next move. In the meantime, I think you owe me the truth, Mary. Or whatever your name really is." Mary looked at him for a long moment, something like resignation passing over her features. "The children need to rest first," she said finally. "After they're asleep, I'll tell you what I can." Jackson nodded, accepting this temporary truce. As darkness fell and the storm raged outside, they went through the motions of an evening routine dinner, washing up, settling the children for the night. Lily asked for a story, and to Jackson's surprise, Mary looked to him. "Perhaps Mr. Harlow would read to you tonight," she suggested, her voice gentle as she met his gaze. "A peace offering, perhaps." Jackson hesitated, then selected a book from his shelf, not Shakespeare this time, but a collection of frontier tales he'd picked up years ago. He sat awkwardly at the edge of the bed and began to read, his deep voice filling the cabin with stories of brave explorers and untamed wilderness. Lily listened with rapt attention, her eyes growing heavy only near the end of the second tale. As she drifted off to sleep, one small hand reached out, coming to rest on Jackson's arm with innocent trust. The touch was like a physical blow. How long had it been since anyone had reached for him with anything but fear or business? How long since he'd allowed himself to care whether someone lived or died beyond the calculation of bounties and survival? Mary gently tucked the blankets around Lily and David, then moved to the fire, gesturing for Jackson to join her. They sat in silence for a moment, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces, making ghosts of them both. "Your name isn't Mary Wilson, is it?" Jackson finally asked, his voice low. She stared into the fire, her profile achingly familiar in the golden light. "No," she admitted, "it's not." "Then who are you?" She turned to face him fully, her eyes reflecting the flames. "I think you already know." Jackson's throat tightened. "I need to hear you say it." A tear slipped down her cheek, quickly brushed away. "My name is Eleanor Fisher," she whispered. Or at least it was. The world seemed to stop. 5 years of grief, of anger, of emptiness, all suspended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. How? The question emerged as little more than a breath. Eleanor, for she was Eleanor, he knew it now, beyond any doubt, folded her hands in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "The fire wasn't an accident," she said, each word measured as if it caused her physical pain. "It was set to cover my disappearance." "By Blackwood," she nodded. "I worked as a secretary for Judge Patterson before we met. I saw things I shouldn't have, documents proving Blackwood's involvement in smuggling, bribery, murder. I made copies as insurance hid them somewhere safe. Somehow he found out." Jackson struggled to process this. "Why didn't you come to me? I was a deputy marshal then. I could have protected you." "They threatened you," Eleanor said simply. "Said they'd kill you if I didn't cooperate. Said they'd make it slow." Her voice broke. "I believed them." "So the fire? They took me the night before, paid the landlord to claim I was inside. The bones they found," she shuddered. "I don't know whose they were. I never asked." Jackson felt sick. The thought of Eleanor being taken while he'd been oblivious of someone else's remains being passed off as hers, it was almost too much to bear. "And after," he pressed, needing to know everything now, no matter how painful. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the sleeping children. "They took me west to Blackwood's estate outside Denver. I was valuable to him, not just because of what I knew, but—" She swallowed hard. "He enjoyed breaking people, especially women with education, with spirit." Jackson's fists clenched, rage building in his chest. "Did he—" "No," Eleanor cut him off. "Not personally. That wasn't his style. He preferred to watch others carry out his will." Her voice had gone flat, detached, as if she were recounting events that had happened to someone else. "I was already with child when they took me. Your child." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. "Lily," he whispered. Eleanor nodded. "I feared they would take her from me when she was born, but Blackwood had other ideas. He said watching me raise your child in captivity was a more fitting punishment. Punishment for what? For you, Eleanor said quietly, though you never knew it. Before Jackson could question this cryptic statement, she continued, when Lily was 3, Blackwood forced me to marry one of his associates, a cruel man named Wilson. Hence the name I use now. David is his son. Her voice caught. Wilson died 6 months ago, a fall from his horse. After his death, Blackwood decided we were no longer worth keeping. He sold us to settle Wilson's debts. The enormity of it all, 5 years of captivity, of suffering, while he'd been free to grieve and move on, overwhelmed Jackson. He rose abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin, unable to contain the storm of emotions raging within him. Why didn't you tell me who you were last night? He demanded. Why the pretense? Eleanor's eyes followed him, wary but steady. Habit, she said simply. Survival. For 5 years I've been Mary Wilson. Eleanor Fisher died in that fire. I wasn't sure you'd believe me. And if you did, she hesitated. I wasn't sure you want me back. Not like this. Not with another man's child. The raw vulnerability in her voice stopped Jackson in his tracks. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his, the first deliberate contact between them since their reunion. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I searched for you. For months after the fire, I refused to believe you were gone. I interrogated witnesses, threatened the landlord, dug through the ashes myself. When I finally accepted you were dead, something in me died too. Eleanor's tears fell freely now. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Jackson. Don't, he said fiercely. Don't apologize for surviving, for protecting our daughter. Our daughter, the words hung between them, enormous and fragile. Eleanor's hands trembled in his. What happens now, she asked, and in that question was the weight of 5 lost years of choices, made and unmade, of a future neither of them had dared to imagine still existed. Jackson looked toward the bed where Lily and David slept, unaware of the world reshaping itself around them. Then back to Eleanor, whose face he'd seen in dreams and nightmares alike since the day he'd believed her gone forever. Now, he said softly, we fight. Outside, the storm raged on, snow piling against the cabin walls like a fortress of ice. But inside, where the fire cast its warm glow over reunited souls, a different kind of storm was brewing. One made of truth and lies, love and vengeance, and the fierce determination of hearts too stubborn to stay broken. Dawn arrived with eerie stillness, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Snow lay 3 feet deep around the cabin, transforming the landscape into an alien terrain of white waves and blue shadows. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Jackson had slept little, his mind too full of Eleanor's revelations. She had finally succumbed to exhaustion near midnight, curled protectively around the children on the bed. He'd watched over them until his eyes burned, afraid that if he closed them, this miracle would vanish like morning mist. Now, as pale light filtered through the frosted window, Jackson stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. The familiar ritual anchored him in a reality that had shifted dramatically beneath his feet. Eleanor was alive. The woman he'd mourned, whose absence had hollowed him out and set him adrift, breathed and spoke and moved in his cabin as if conjured from his most desperate prayers. And Lily, the child with familiar eyes and stubborn chin, was his daughter, a daughter conceived in love but born into captivity, who had never known her father until now. The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm him. 5 years lost. 5 years of Eleanor enduring God knew what horrors, while he'd been free to roam, to drink, to lose himself in the mindless pursuit of bounties. And now Blackwood, the architect of their separation, was hunting them. The man who had stolen Eleanor, who had watched her suffer, who had kept Jackson's child from him, was mere miles away with an army at his command. Jackson's hands tightened around the coffee pot, knuckles white. The rage that surged through him was a living thing, hot and vicious. It would be so easy to ride into town to find Blackwood, to end this with lead and blood. But such recklessness would only endanger Eleanor and the children further. No, this would require planning patience, qualities the old Jackson had possessed in abundance, but that the bounty hunter had all but forgotten. A small sound drew his attention. Lily stood watching him in hair tousled from sleep, the too large nightgown, making her appear even smaller than she was. "Good morning," Jackson said, his voice softening automatically. Lily approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "Is there more snow?" she asked, looking toward the window. Jackson nodded. "Too much to go anywhere today." A smile brightened her face. "I like snow," she confided. "In Denver, I could only watch it from the window. They wouldn't let me play in it." The casual reference to her captivity twisted something in Jackson's chest. What else had his daughter been denied? What simple joys had been kept from her? "Well," he said, clearing his throat against sudden emotion, "there's plenty to play in now, and no one to stop you." Lily's eyes widened. "Really, Mama, too? If she wants to." Lily's gaze grew serious, evaluating him with that uncanny intensity that seemed beyond her years. "You know, don't you?" she asked. "About Mama." Jackson hesitated, unsure how much Eleanor had told her, how much a child could understand of their complicated situation. "What about her?" "That she used to have a different name. That she knew you before." Lily stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper, though Eleanor and David still slept. "She has a picture of you. She keeps it hidden in a little box, but I saw it once. She cried when she looked at it." Jackson's heart constricted. Eleanor had kept a picture of him all these years, risking punishment if it had been discovered. "Yes," he admitted, "I know now." Lily nodded, satisfied. "Are you my real father? Not like Mr. Wilson was to David?" The directness of the question took Jackson's breath away. How did one answer such a thing to a child who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty? "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Lily absorbed this without visible surprise, as if confirming something she'd long suspected. "I thought so," she said. "I have your eyes, and this." She turned her head, pushing back her hair to reveal a small, crescent-shaped birthmark just below her ear, identical to the one Jackson had borne since birth. He reached out instinctively, his rough fingers gentle as they brushed the mark. His mark, on his child. The evidence of their connection made flesh. "Does that make you happy or sad?" Lily asked, watching his face with that same intense scrutiny. "Happy." Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion. "Happier than I've been in a very long time." Lily smiled, then a real smile that transformed her solemn face into something bright and hopeful. "Me too," she said, and with the simple acceptance of childhood, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. Jackson froze for an instant, overwhelmed by the small, warm weight against him. Then slowly he embraced his daughter for the first time, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other arm secure around her shoulders. She smelled of sleep and innocence, this miracle he hadn't known existed until yesterday. A soft sound made him look up. Eleanor stood near the bed, David in her arms, watching them with eyes swimming in tears. The grief and joy in her expression mirrored what Jackson felt, happiness at this reunion tempered by the knowledge of all they had lost, all that had been stolen from them. "Mama," Lily broke from Jackson's embrace to run to Eleanor. "He said we can play out in the snow, can we?" Eleanor smoothed her daughter's hair, her smile tremulous. "After breakfast, perhaps, if Mr. Harlow doesn't mind." "Jackson," he corrected gently. "My name is Jackson, Eleanor." The sound of her real name spoken aloud seemed to affect her deeply. She nodded, blinking back tears. "After breakfast, Jackson." The morning passed in a strange domestic rhythm, as if they were learning to be a family in accelerated time. Jackson fried salt pork and potatoes, while Eleanor nursed David and Lily set the table with careful precision. They ate together, conversation stilted at first, but gradually easing as Lily chattered about the books on Jackson's shelf and asked endless questions about his horse. After breakfast, true to his word, Jackson helped bundle the children for the snow. David was too young for more than a brief introduction to the cold, but Lily was determined to experience everything she'd been denied. Jackson showed her how to make snowballs, how to lie back and create snow angels, how to catch flakes on her tongue. Her laughter, bright and uninhibited, filled the clearing around the cabin, drawing smiles even from Eleanor, who watched from the doorway with David. It was in these moments of simple joy that Jackson caught glimpses of what might have been, what should have been, had the fire never happened, had Eleanor not been taken. They should have raised Lily together, should have celebrated her first steps, her first words. They should have been a family all along. The thought brought both pain and determination. They couldn't reclaim those lost years, but perhaps they could build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. As the day wore on and the temperature dropped, they retreated to the warmth of the cabin. Lily, exhausted from her adventures in the snow, fell asleep on the bearskin rug before the fire curled like a small comma. David, too, succumbed to slumber, nestled in a makeshift cradle Jackson had constructed from a wooden crate and blankets. With the children asleep, the tension between Jackson and Eleanor resurfaced. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many wounds still raw. "You said Blackwood took you as punishment for me," Jackson said quietly, mindful of the sleeping children. "What did you mean by that?" Eleanor sighed, her fingers working at an invisible seam in her skirt, a nervous habit he remembered from before. "You worked for him once, didn't you, before we met?" The question struck like a physical blow. "How did you know that?" "Blackwood told me, showed me records, letters." Eleanor's gaze was steady now, meeting his. "You were a deputy in his pocket. You helped escort shipments for him look the other way when certain cargoes crossed the border." Jackson felt cold despite the fire's warmth. His past, the part he'd buried deep and tried to forget, laid bare before the woman he'd loved, still loved. "I didn't know what was in those shipments," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Not at first. When I figured it out, I quit, reported what I knew to the federal marshal." "I believe you," Eleanor said softly. "But Blackwood never forgave the betrayal. When he discovered I was your fiancé, he saw an opportunity for revenge. The realization was sickening. He took you because of me, because I crossed him." "He took me because he's a monster," Eleanor corrected firmly. "The blame is his, not yours." But Jackson couldn't accept that absolution. If he hadn't worked for Blackwood, if he hadn't been so blind, so naive in his younger days, Eleanor might never have suffered. Lily might have grown up with both parents in safety and love. "I should have found you," he said, voice rough with self-recrimination. "I should have kept looking." Eleanor rose from her chair, crossing to kneel before him. She took his hands in hers, the first time she had initiated contact between them. "You thought I was dead, Jackson. You had no reason to believe otherwise." "I felt it," he admitted. "Something in me never accepted that you were gone. But I let them convince me. Let myself be convinced, because it was easier than the alternative." "And what was that?" "That you were alive somewhere, suffering, and I was failing you with every breath I took." Eleanor's grip tightened on his hands. "You didn't fail me. You're here now. You found me against all odds." "No," Jackson said. "You found me. Through Lily." At the mention of their daughter, they both looked to where she slept peacefully, unaware of the weight of history and pain that surrounded her existence. "She's so much like you," Eleanor said softly. "Stubborn, curious, brave beyond reason." "She has your heart," Jackson countered. "I saw it yesterday when she stood on that auction block chin up trying to protect you and David." The shared observation, this joint recognition of their child's nature, created a bridge between them spanning 5 years of separate suffering. "What happens when the snow melts?" Eleanor asked, the practical question breaking the moment. "Blackwood won't stop looking. He can't afford to let me go, not with what I know." Jackson considered this. "The evidence you gathered, where is it?" "Hidden in Willow Creek, where we were to be married." Eleanor's eyes held his. "In the hollow oak where you proposed to me." The location struck Jackson with its significance. Of course she would choose that place, a spot known only to them, a memory Blackwood couldn't possibly have uncovered. If we had that evidence, it would destroy him. It would destroy him, Eleanor finished. But getting to it won't be easy. Willow Creek is 2 days' ride from here, and Blackwood's men will be watching the roads. Jackson nodded, mind already working through possibilities. We need allies, Sheriff Calloway for one. He's no friend to Blackwood, though he has to be careful given Blackwood's influence. Can we trust him? As much as anyone in these parts. He's a good man caught in a bad position. Jackson paused, thinking. There's someone else who might help us. Mrs. Abernathy. Eleanor frowned. The widow from Willow Creek. The same. Her daughter disappeared around the time Blackwood established his operation in Colorado. She never believed the story that the girl ran off with the traveling salesman. You think Blackwood took her too? I think it's likely. And if there's anyone who hates Blackwood as much as we do, it's Maggie Abernathy. They fell silent, the enormity of what they were considering settling over them. Taking on Marcus Blackwood meant risking everything, not just their lives, but the future they might build together, the safety of their children. We could run, Eleanor said, giving voice to the thought that hung between them. Take the children and head west, California perhaps, or north to Canada. We could, Jackson agreed, but we'd always be looking over our shoulders. And Blackwood would keep doing to others what he did to you, to us. Eleanor's expression hardened, a glimpse of steel beneath the vulnerability. No, she said firmly. No more running, no more victims. Jackson felt a surge of pride at her resolve, at the strength that 5 years of captivity had failed to break. This was the Eleanor he remembered, compassionate but fierce, unwilling to accept injustice, even when the easier path lay open before her. It won't be easy, he warned, and it will be dangerous. Living is dangerous, Eleanor replied simply, especially for women and children in a world where men like Blackwood hold power. She looked again to Lily and David, her gaze softening. But they deserve a chance at freedom. Real freedom, not just the absence of chains. Jackson followed her gaze, his chest tight with emotions he'd thought long buried, love, protectiveness, hope. Then we fight, he said quietly. Not just for ourselves, but for them. For the future. Eleanor nodded, determination settling over her features like a mantle. In that moment, despite the worn dress and the shadows under her eyes, she looked more like herself than she had since he'd found her, a woman of courage and conviction, the woman he had fallen in love with years ago. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But within the cabin's walls, plans were being laid, strengths assessed, weaknesses acknowledged. A battle was coming, one that would determine not just their fate, but perhaps the fate of others trapped in Blackwood's web of power and cruelty. As the day waned and shadows lengthened across the snow, Jackson and Eleanor sat side by side at the table, heads bent over a rough map of the territory. Their shoulders occasionally brushed as they traced routes and discussed possibilities. Each touch a small affirmation of the connection that had survived separation, grief, and betrayal. They were no longer the people they had been 5 years ago. The deputy marshal with unwavering faith in justice had become a cynical bounty hunter. The bright-eyed school teacher had endured horrors that left visible and invisible scars. But in their determination to protect their children, to right the wrongs done to them, perhaps they could forge something new, something stronger for having been broken and remade. As night fell and the children stirred, demanding attention and care, Jackson watched Eleanor sing Lily and David to sleep, her voice soft but clear in the quiet cabin. The same lullaby she'd hummed while making snow angels with Lily that morning, the same melody that had occasionally drifted through his dreams these past 5 years. And for the first time since the fire that had supposedly taken Eleanor from him, Jackson Harlow felt the ember of hope glow warm in his chest, not the desperate, grasping hope of a man who couldn't accept reality, but the steady, determined hope of one who had glimpsed a future worth fighting for. a future that against all odds might still be theirs to claim. 3 days passed before the snow melted enough to make travel possible. 3 days of careful words and cautious touches of learning to exist in each other's spaces after years of absence. 3 days of watching Lily build snowmen, with Jackson's help, of seeing Eleanor's shoulders gradually lose their perpetual tension as she settled into the relative safety of the cabin. For Jackson, these days were a revelation. Each new discovery about his daughter, her fondness for drawing, her serious approach to helping with chores, her surprising knowledge of constellations, filled him with equal measures of joy and grief. Joy for the remarkable child she was becoming, grief for all the moments he had missed. He found himself studying Eleanor too, cataloging the changes 5 years had wrought. She was thinner than he remembered, with fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her hands, once soft from books and teaching, now bore calluses from hard work. She moved differently, more cautiously, more aware of her surroundings, as if perpetually anticipating a blow. But there were glimpses of the woman he had known, in her patience with Lily's endless questions, in her quiet humming as she rocked David to sleep, in the determined set of her jaw when they discussed confronting Blackwood. On the morning of the fourth day, Jackson stood at the window watching as the rising sun turned the melting snow to diamonds. The paths he'd cleared to the stable and woodpile were widening, dark earth showing through the white blanket that had briefly transformed the world. "It's time," he said, not turning from the window. Eleanor paused in feeding David her spoon, hovering midair. "Today, the roads will be passable by noon." Jackson finally faced her, his expression grave. "If we're going to move, it should be now, before Blackwood expands his search this far." Eleanor nodded, a soldier accepting orders. The transformation in her demeanor from the tentative woman of moments before to this resolute survivor still startled him. "What's the plan?" she asked, practical as always. Jackson crossed to the table where a rough map lay spread, weighted at the corners with cups and a knife. "We can't go directly to Willow Creek. Too obvious. Blackwood will have men watching the main routes." His finger traced a winding path across the paper. "We'll head north first, make it look like we're running for the territorial line, then circle back through Cedar Canyon. It's a hard trail, but passable with care." "And the children?" The question hung heavy between them. Two small lives now depended on their decisions, their ability to navigate the dangers ahead. "Mrs. Abernathy," Jackson said after a moment, "will take them to her farm on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. It's remote, easily defensible, and she has no love for Blackwood." "Can we trust her with our children?" Eleanor's voice held an edge of steel. "With her life," Jackson assured her. "She lost her daughter to Blackwood's operations. She understands what's at stake." Eleanor considered this, then nodded slowly. "When do we leave?" "I'll ride ahead to make arrangements with Mrs. Abernathy. You and the children follow with the wagon after sundown. Less chance of being spotted that way." A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. Separating already? The question held layers of meaning that made Jackson's chest tighten. "Just for a few hours," he said softly. "I'll meet you at Broken Tree Creek before full dark." She held his gaze, searching for reassurance or perhaps resolve. Whatever she sought, she seemed to find it, for she nodded again. "We'll be ready." Jackson hesitated, then crossed the room to where she sat. Carefully giving her time to retreat if she wished, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "I won't let you down again, Eleanor. Not you, not Lily, not David." She placed her hand over his, a gesture of acceptance, if not quite forgiveness. "I know." It was the closest they had come to acknowledging the complicated tangle of emotions between them. Trust broken and rebuilt. Love buried and unearthed, blame assigned and absolved. Neither ready yet for more, but both acknowledging the possibility that more might someday exist. The moment was broken by Lily's entrance from the small alcove where she slept. "Are we going somewhere?" she asked, ever observant. Jackson and Eleanor exchanged glances. They had agreed not to shield Lily from difficult truths her short life had already taught her, that adults who lied even with good intentions could not be trusted. Yes, Eleanor said, extending an arm to draw her daughter close. We're going to visit a friend of Mr. Harlow's of your father's, a nice lady who lives on a farm with chickens and a big garden. Lily's eyes widened at the casual confirmation of Jackson's paternity. They had explained the situation to her the day before as simply and honestly as possible. She had accepted the news with surprising composure, as if it merely confirmed something she had always suspected. Will the bad men be looking for us there too? She asked now, her small face serious. No, Jackson said, kneeling to meet her eyes. Mrs. Abernathy's farm is hidden away, and she knows how to keep people safe. And then what? Lily pressed. After the farm, Jackson glanced at Eleanor, seeking guidance. How much should they share with a child not yet 5 years old? Then your father and I will get something important, Eleanor said carefully. Something that will help us stop the bad men for good. Lily considered this, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. Like evidence, she asked. Like in the books where the sheriff catches the outlaws. Jackson couldn't help but smile at her perceptiveness. Yes, exactly like that. Evidence that will make sure they can't hurt anyone else. Good, Lily said with surprising vehemence. They shouldn't be allowed to hurt more mamas and children. The simple declaration delivered with a child's absolute conviction struck Jackson to the core. This was his daughter, fierce and compassionate, caring the best of Eleanor and himself even after years of captivity and hardship. No, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. They shouldn't, and we're going to make sure they don't. The rest of the day passed in careful preparation. Jackson checked and rechecked his weapons, pack supplies, and readied the wagon. Eleanor sorted through the meager possessions they had: clothing for the children, a blanket, the few books Lily had grown attached to. Their lives reduced to what could be carried, what was essential for survival. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jackson saddled his horse. The time for departure had come. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cabin, David in her arms, Lily at her side. A tableau that could have been from a simpler life, a wife and children seeing their man off for the day. But the rifle leaning against the doorframe and the tension in Eleanor's posture told a different story. I'll see you at Broken Tree Creek, Jackson said, swinging into the saddle. 2 hours after sundown. If I'm not there, we'll wait until dawn, Eleanor finished for him, then continued to Mrs. Abernathy's on our own. Jackson nodded, throat tight. The pragmatic planning for worst-case scenarios, another reminder of how their lives had been shaped by violence and loss. Lily stepped forward, her small face upturned. Be careful, Father, she said solemnly, using the formal address that still sounded strange coming from her young lips. Jackson leaned down from the saddle, impulsively pressing a kiss to her forehead. I will, Lilyflower. Take care of your mama and brother for me. She nodded, serious as a judge, and stepped back to Eleanor's side. Jackson straightened, meeting Eleanor's gaze one last time. So much remained unsaid between them, but this was not the moment for it. Instead, he tipped his hat in a gesture that belonged to their past, to a time of simple courtship and uncomplicated affection. The ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips, a recognition of the reference. Then it was gone, replaced by the vigilant expression that seemed to be her default now. Jackson turned his horse and rode away, resisting the urge to look back. The image of them, standing in the doorway, his family against all odds, would have to sustain him through what was to come. The road to Pine Ridge wound through hills still patched with melting snow. Jackson rode with the caution of a man who knew he might be hunted, using the cover of trees where possible, avoiding open spaces where a distant observer might spot a lone rider. The town itself was little more than a cluster of buildings around a dusty main street, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and scattered houses. Unlike larger settlements, Pine Ridge had no sheriff of its own, relying instead on circuit judges and the occasional visit from county lawmen. This lack of authority made it both dangerous and useful, a place where a man could disappear if he had the means and the will. Jackson avoided the town proper, circling around to approach Mrs. Abernathy's farm from the north. The property sat nestled in a small valley sheltered by pine-covered hills on three sides. A weathered two-story farmhouse, a barn, and various outbuildings made up the homestead. Smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of habitation. He approached cautiously, aware that Maggie Abernathy was known to greet uninvited guests with a shotgun. As if on cue, the front door opened as he neared the house, and the barrel of said shotgun appeared, followed by the woman herself. "That's far enough," called a firm voice. "State your business." Jackson reined in his horse, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "It's Jackson Harlow, Mrs. Abernathy. We've met before." The shotgun lowered slightly. "Harlow, the bounty hunter." "Yes, ma'am." "What brings you to my door? If you're hunting someone, I haven't seen a soul in weeks." Jackson dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "I'm not hunting. I'm here to ask for help." This seemed to surprise her. The shotgun lowered further, though she didn't set it aside. "What kind of help would a man like you need from an old widow?" "The kind that involves sheltering those who need protection." From Marcus Blackwood. At the name, Mrs. Abernathy's expression hardened. "Come inside," she said after a moment. "Any enemy of Blackwood's is welcome at my table." The interior of the farmhouse was neat and spare, with handmade furniture and faded curtains. A fire burned in the hearth, casting warm light over the simple room. Mrs. Abernathy gestured for Jackson to sit at the table, resting her shotgun against the wall within easy reach. Maggie Abernathy was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that had seen more than their share of hardship. Her husband had died a decade earlier, leaving her to run the farm alone until her daughter Catherine was old enough to help. Then Catherine had disappeared 3 years ago, allegedly eloping with a salesman passing through town. Mrs. Abernathy had never believed the story. "So," she said, pouring coffee into two chipped mugs, "what has Blackwood done to earn your enmity? Last I heard, you kept to yourself, tracking outlaws for the reward money." Jackson accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "It's a long story. I've got time." She settled across from him, her gaze direct and unflinching. So Jackson told her about Eleanor, about the fire, about the years of believing she was dead, but only to find her alive at an auction block. He told her about Lily and David, about Blackwood's revenge plot, about the evidence hidden in Willow Creek that could bring the man to justice. Mrs. Abernathy listened without interruption, her weathered face revealing little. Only when Jackson mentioned the women Blackwood kept captive did a flash of pain cross her features. "You think Catherine might have been one of them?" she said when he finished. Not a question, but a statement. "I think it's possible," Jackson admitted. "Blackwood's operation is extensive, and the timing fits." Mrs. Abernathy was silent for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it held answers. "I've always known," she said finally, "known she didn't run off with some salesman. Catherine wasn't the type. She had plans, was saving for school in Denver." Her hands tightened around her mug. "I told the sheriff, but he said without evidence there was nothing to be done. Said young women get restless, make impulsive decisions." "Sheriff Reynolds?" Jackson asked, recalling the man who had held the office in Penridge years ago. "The same. Found out later he was on Blackwood's payroll." A bitter smile twisted her lips. "Found out too late to help my girl." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding of corruption and power misused. "I need a safe place for Eleanor and the children," Jackson said, after a respectful silence. "Just for a few days while we retrieve the evidence from Willow Creek. And then we take it to Judge Hollister in Denver. He's one of the few who hasn't been bought. With solid evidence, he can issue warrants that even Blackwood's money can't override." Mrs. Abernathy considered this, her expression calculating. "And what about the women? The ones Blackwood still holds? If we can find them, free them." "If," she interrupted sharply. A big word, Mr. Harlow. My Catherine has been gone 3 years. If she's still alive, still held somewhere. She trailed off the possibilities too painful to voice. Jackson understood her fear. The longer a person remained in captivity, the less chance they emerged unbroken. Eleanor had survived with her spirit intact, but she had had Lily to live for, to protect. Others might not have been so fortunate. We'll do everything possible to find all of his victims, Jackson promised. But first we need that evidence. Without it, Blackwood walks free, regardless of how many accusations are made against him. Mrs. Abernathy nodded slowly, reaching a decision. Your family can stay here. The root cellar has a hidden room. My husband built it during the border troubles. It's not comfortable, but it's safe. No one will find them there if trouble comes calling. Relief washed through Jackson. Thank you. They'll arrive after dark, coming from the east and along Broken Tree Creek. I'll watch for them. She rose, signaling an end to the conversation. You should go if you plan to meet them. Daylight's wasting, and Blackwood has eyes everywhere these days. Jackson stood, extending his hand. I'm grateful, Mrs. Abernathy. She took his hand briefly, her grip firm. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Harlow. Gratitude is for after we've won. And taking down a man like Blackwood. She shook her head. Well, let's just say I'll believe it when I see him swing. The stark assessment was fair. Marcus Blackwood had built his empire on blood and fear, protected it with money and influence. Bringing him to justice would require more than evidence and determination. It would require luck, perfect timing, and perhaps divine intervention. But looking into Mrs. Abernathy's eyes, Jackson saw the same burning resolve he felt in his own heart. The determination of those who had lost too much to a man who believed himself untouchable. We'll see him pay. Jackson said the words of promise. He intended to keep it or die trying, one way or another. Broken Tree Creek earned its name from the lightning-struck oak that had fallen across the water decades ago, creating a natural bridge, now worn smooth by weather and passage. Jackson arrived as the sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. He secured his horse in a copse of pines, then took up position on a rocky outcropping that offered a clear view of the approach from the direction of his cabin. The waiting was the hardest part. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Jackson's mind filled with all that could have gone wrong. Eleanor and the children might have been discovered. They might have had trouble with the wagon. They might have encountered Blackwood's men on the road. Each minute that passed without sight of them wound his anxiety tighter. His hand strayed repeatedly to his revolver, checking that it was loaded and ready. The weight of it was reassuring, a concrete solution to at least one kind of problem. It was nearly 2 hours after sundown when he finally heard it, the distant creak of wagon wheels, the soft nicker of a horse. Jackson tensed, squinting into the darkness. A shape emerged from the shadows, the wagon moving slowly along the creek bed, Eleanor at the reins. Relief surged through him, followed immediately by caution. He watched carefully for signs of pursuit or ambush before whistling softly 3 notes, a signal they had agreed upon. The wagon halted. After a moment, the answering whistle came back, 2 notes, then 1. All clear. Jackson made his way down from his position, approaching the wagon with quick strides. Eleanor's face in the moonlight was tense but determined. Lily sat beside her, wrapped in a blanket, while David slept in a makeshift cradle secured to the wagon bed. Any trouble? Jackson asked quietly, reaching up to help Lily down. Eleanor shook her head. The roads were clear, no sign of anyone watching the cabin or following us. That's something, at least. He lifted Lily into his arms, surprising himself with how natural the gesture felt after just a few days. Mrs. Abernathy is expecting us. She has a hidden room prepared just in case. You trust her. Eleanor's voice held no accusation, only the wariness of a woman who had learned the hard way that trust could be fatal. I do, Jackson affirmed. She lost her daughter to Blackwood. She wants justice as much as we do. This seemed to satisfy Eleanor. She gathered David from his cradle, cradling him against her chest. Lead the way. They traveled in tense silence, Jackson driving the wagon, now Eleanor beside him with the children. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, the moon casting enough light to navigate by. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Mrs. Abernathy was waiting on the porch when they arrived, a lantern held high to guide them in. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Eleanor and the children, but she recovered quickly, gesturing them inside with brisk efficiency. "There's stew on the stove, and bread still warm," she said by way of greeting. "The little ones must be hungry after the journey." Lily, normally shy with strangers, seemed to take an immediate liking to Mrs. Abernathy. Perhaps it was the mention of food, or perhaps it was the grandmotherly aura the older woman projected despite her stern demeanor. "Thank you for taking us in," Eleanor said, her voice formal but sincere. Mrs. Abernathy studied her for a moment, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. "No thanks needed. Any enemy of Blackwoods is a friend of mine." She turned to Lily with a softening expression. "And what's your name, young lady?" "Lily," came the quiet response. "And that's my brother, David." "Well, Lily, I think there might be some honey cakes left from baking day. Would you like one after your stew?" Lily's eyes widened at this unexpected treat. She looked to Eleanor for permission, receiving a small nod in return. "Yes, please, ma'am." "Good manners," Mrs. Abernathy approved. "Your mama's raised you right despite the circumstances." The simple acknowledgement of Eleanor's mothering under difficult conditions seemed to touch her deeply. Jackson saw her blink rapidly, composing herself before responding. "I've done my best," she said softly. "It shows." Mrs. Abernathy's tone brooked no argument. "Now come, all of you. Food first, then we'll sort out sleeping arrangements." The kitchen was warm and smelled of herbs and wood smoke. Mrs. Abernathy served up bowls of rabbit stew thick with vegetables and barley and sliced fresh bread still warm from the oven. Jackson couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a home-cooked meal that hadn't come from his own rudimentary efforts over a campfire. As they ate, he observed the interactions between Mrs. Abernathy and Eleanor, two women from different generations bound by loss and resilience. There was a caution in Eleanor's demeanor, a wariness that spoke of lessons hard learned. But there was also a gradual relaxation as Mrs. Abernathy treated her with matter-of-fact respect, neither pitying nor prying. Lily, for her part, seemed to bloom under the older woman's attention. She answered questions about her favorite books and colors, gradually volunteering information without prompting. When Mrs. Abernathy produced the promised honey cakes, Lily's delighted smile illuminated the kitchen more brightly than the lamp. After the meal, Mrs. Abernathy showed them to their quarters, a small bedroom on the second floor for Eleanor and the children, and a cot in the study for Jackson. Then she took them to the root cellar behind the kitchen, revealing the hidden room Jackson had mentioned. "My Thomas built this during the border wars," she explained, pressing a concealed lever that caused a section of wall to swing inward. "It's not much, but it's saved lives before." The hidden space was small but had been prepared with care blankets, a lantern, water, and some basic provisions stacked neatly against one wall. A tiny air shaft, cleverly disguised as part of the cellar's ventilation system, provided fresh air. "If trouble comes," Mrs. Abernathy continued, "you get in here and pull the door shut. It locks from the inside. Don't make a sound no matter what you hear. Don't come out until someone gives the password." She looked at each of them in turn. "The password is Catherine's Hope. Remember that." The seriousness of her instructions sobered them all, even Lily, who pressed closer to Eleanor's side. "Let's pray it doesn't come to that," Jackson said, "but we're grateful for the precaution." Mrs. Abernathy nodded, then led them back upstairs. "You must be tired after your journey. I'll leave you to rest. We can talk more in the morning." As she turned to go, Eleanor reached out, hesitantly touching the older woman's arm. "Mrs. Abernathy, about your daughter, I'm so sorry." Mrs. Abernathy stilled her back to them. For a moment, Jackson thought she might rebuff the sympathy. Then her shoulders sagged slightly. 3 years, she said without turning. 3 years of not knowing whether she's alive or dead, whether she's suffering or at peace wherein. She paused, her voice tightening. I pray for her death some nights. God forgive me, but I do. Better that than what Blackwood might have done to her. The raw admission hung in the air, its honesty too painful to acknowledge directly. Eleanor's hand fell away, but her expression showed understanding rather than shock. If she's out there, she said softly, we'll find her. I promise you that. Mrs. Abernathy turned then, her weathered face composed once more. Don't make promises you might not be able to keep, Mrs. Harlow, but I appreciate the sentiment. With that, she left them, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Eleanor stood motionless, a complex mixture of emotions playing across her face. She called me Mrs. Harlow, she said finally, her voice barely audible. Jackson had noticed that too, the assumption of a relationship that existed in legality only in the past tense as a broken engagement. Does it bother you? He asked carefully. Eleanor shook her head slowly. No, it's just strange. To hear it spoken so casually, as if the last 5 years never happened, as if we had married after all. The wistfulness in her voice opened a door Jackson had been hesitant to approach. We still could, he said, the words escaping before he could consider their wisdom. If you wanted to, after this is over. Eleanor's eyes met his wide with surprise and something else, fear, hope. Jackson. You don't have to answer now, he added quickly. It's not the time. I shouldn't have. No, she interrupted. It's not that. She glanced at Lily, who was examining a patchwork quilt on the bed, seemingly absorbed but undoubtedly listening. It's just, we're different people now. Both of us. I'm not the Eleanor you knew, and you're not the same Jackson. The truth of this struck him with unexpected force. 5 years had changed them, shaped them in ways both visible and invisible. The eager deputy and the idealistic schoolteacher were gone, replaced by a hardened bounty hunter and a survivor of unimaginable trauma. I know, he acknowledged, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe who we are now can still find a way forward, together. Eleanor's expression softened, a hint of the woman she had been showing through the careful facade she maintained. Maybe, she conceded, but first we have to survive what's coming. The reminder of their precarious situation sobered them both. The tender moment receded, replaced by the practical concerns that had dominated their existence since their reunion. You should rest, Jackson said, stepping back. Tomorrow we'll plan our route to Willow Creek and what comes after. Eleanor nodded, her attention already shifting to Lily and David, the constants in her disrupted world. Good night, Jackson. Good night, Eleanor. He left them to settle in, making his way to the small study where his cot waited. But sleep eluded him as he lay in the darkness, mind racing with plans and contingencies, with hopes and fears too tangled to separate. Somewhere in this same house, Eleanor and his children slept, a miracle he still couldn't quite believe. And somewhere beyond these walls, Marcus Blackwood hunted them, a shadow that threatened to engulf the fragile new beginning they had found. Jackson turned onto his side, hand resting on the revolver beneath his pillow. He would be ready when the time came, ready to protect what was his, to fight for the future that had been stolen from them once before. This time he would not fail. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through frosted windows and the smell of coffee and frying bacon wafting up from the kitchen. Jackson rose early, checking the perimeter of the property before joining Mrs. Abernathy downstairs. She acknowledged his caution with a nod as he entered. No strangers passed in the night, she informed him, flipping bacon in a cast-iron skillet. But I spotted riders on the North Ridge at dawn. Just passing through seemed like, but worth noting. Jackson accepted this information with a grim nod. Blackwood's men. Hard to say at that distance. They weren't wearing any obvious markings. She transferred the bacon to a plate lined with cloth to absorb the grease. How long before you head to Willow Creek? Today, if possible. The sooner we secure the evidence, the better. Mrs. Abernathy glanced toward the stairs where sounds of movement indicated Eleanor and the children were awake. And them, they'll stay here, if you're still willing to shelter them. She waved away his caution. I said they could stay, and I meant it. Just wondering about your timeline. 3 days to Willow Creek and back, if the weather holds and you don't run into trouble. That's my hope. Jackson agreed, though both knew that trouble was more likely than not in the current circumstances. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, David in her arms and Lily at her side. Both children were freshly washed, their hair combed close neat despite their worn condition. Eleanor had always taken pride in appearances, Jackson remembered. It seemed that even years of captivity hadn't changed that aspect of her character. Good morning, she said, her voice composed, though her eyes betrayed wariness. Always assessing, always alert, the vigilance of one who had learned that safety was an illusion. Morning, Mrs. Abernathy replied, gesturing to the table. Sit, eat. We've planning to do. Breakfast was a simple but hearty affair. Bacon, eggs, biscuits, still warm from the oven. Lily ate with enthusiasm while Eleanor managed smaller portions, her attention divided between feeding David and monitoring the conversation. I've been thinking, Mrs. Abernathy said as they finished eating. 2 people traveling together are more conspicuous than one, especially with Blackwood's men watching the roads. Jackson frowned. What are you suggesting? That you go to Willow Creek alone. Mrs. Harlow stays here with the children where it's safe. No, Eleanor's response was immediate and firm. The evidence is hidden where only I know exactly how to find it. And besides, 2 guns are better than 1 if we encounter trouble. Jackson had been about to voice similar objections, but he was struck by Eleanor's mention of 2 guns. The Eleanor he had known 5 years ago had never handled a firearm, had been somewhat opposed to them on principle. Another change wrought by necessity and survival. Mrs. Abernathy seemed to read his thoughts. You know how to use a gun? She asked Eleanor directly. Yes. No elaboration, just a simple affirmation. Good. A woman should know how to defend herself and hers. Mrs. Abernathy turned back to Jackson. Still, the risk of you both being captured or killed is one we have to take, Eleanor finished. The children will be safer here with you than anywhere else. But that evidence is the key to everything, to our freedom, to justice for other victims, to stopping Blackwood permanently. We can't risk failing to retrieve it because one of us was caught or killed en route. The logic was sound if brutal in its assessment. Jackson found himself both proud of and concerned by Eleanor's clear-eyed view of their situation. There's sense in that, Mrs. Abernathy acknowledged, but you'll need to be careful. Take the old miners' trails where you can. Travel by night if necessary. She rose, crossing to a cupboard from which she extracted a folded paper. Here, a map my husband made years ago showing trails the railroad surveyors never found. Might help you avoid Blackwood's patrols. Jackson accepted the map gratefully. Thank you. This could make all the difference. The conversation turned to practical matters, supplies, weapons, contingency plans. Through it all, Jackson was aware of Lily watching them with solemn eyes, absorbing every word despite her young age. She understood perhaps better than they gave her credit for the dangers that faced her family. When the planning was complete, Jackson left to prepare the horses, giving Eleanor time alone with the children. This parting would be harder for her, he knew. 5 years of constant vigilance, of being Lily's sole protector, had forged a bond that defied normal separation. He was checking the saddle cinches when Eleanor joined him in the barn alone. She had changed into clothes more suitable for riding, trousers borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy's absent son, a flannel shirt, a worn leather jacket. With her hair pulled back in a practical braid, she looked nothing like the schoolteacher of 5 years ago, nor the frightened auction captive of days past. This was a new Eleanor, determined, capable, forged in fire. The children, Jackson asked, though he could guess the answer. With Mrs. Abernathy. She's showing Lily how to collect eggs from the hen house. Eleanor ran a hand along the flank of the mare Mrs. Abernathy had provided for her use. Lily took the news well. Better than I expected. She understands we're going to get the evidence that will keep them safe. She's a remarkable child, Jackson said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. She's your daughter, Eleanor replied, a hint of pride breaking through her controlled demeanor. Stubborn, brave, too clever by half. The casual acknowledgement of their shared parentage still had the power to stun Jackson. He cleared his throat against sudden emotion. And David will, he be all right without you? A shadow crossed Eleanor's face at the mention of her son. He's weaned now, and Mrs. Abernathy knows how to care for an infant. He'll miss me, but she trailed off, the unspoken reality hanging between them. David was not Jackson's child. His father had been Eleanor's captor, her forced husband. The boy was innocent of that crime, but his existence was a constant reminder of Eleanor's ordeal. He'll be safe here, Jackson said, filling the awkward silence. And when this is over, we'll make sure he grows up knowing only love and security. Both of them will. Gratitude flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Gratitude for his acceptance of David, for his lack of resentment toward a child born of circumstances beyond her control. Yes, she agreed softly. They will. They finished preparing in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts. The journey ahead would be dangerous, the outcome uncertain. But for the first time in 5 years, they faced the future together rather than alone. As they led the horses from the barn, Lily came running across the yard, a small cloth bundle clutched in her hands. She skidded to a stop before them, slightly breathless. I made you something, she announced, holding out the bundle to Eleanor. For your journey. Eleanor knelt, accepting the offering with appropriate solemnity. Inside the cloth was a small, rough carving of a bird, its wings spread as if in flight. The workmanship was crude but recognizable, clearly the effort of a child using a borrowed pocket knife. Mrs. Abernathy helped me with the sharp parts, Lily explained. It's a sparrow. Like in the story, you always tell me about the sparrow that found its way home even after the storm blew it far away. Eleanor's breath caught audibly. She gathered Lily into a fierce embrace, her composure cracking for the first time since Jackson had found her. It's beautiful, she whispered against her daughter's hair. I'll keep it with me always. Jackson watched the exchange, throat tight with emotion. The bond between mother and daughter, forged in the crucible of their shared captivity, was a tangible thing, beautiful and fierce and unbreakable. When Eleanor released Lily, the child turned to Jackson, her expression suddenly shy. I didn't have time to make you one too, she admitted. That's all right, he assured her, kneeling to her level. Knowing you're here safe is all I need. Lily nodded, accepting this. Then, with a direct gaze that still unsettled him with its maturity, she said, Bring Mama home safe. Promise. The weight of that request, the trust implicit in it, settled on Jackson's shoulders like a physical burden. I promise, he said, the words, a vow he would die to keep. Satisfied, Lily stepped back, allowing Mrs. Abernathy to gather her close. The older woman looked at Eleanor and Jackson with an expression that mingled concern and approval. Go, she said simply. Do what needs doing. We'll be waiting. With final embraces and whispered reassurances, they mounted their horses. As they rode away from the farm, Jackson glanced back to see Lily standing on the porch, one small hand raised in farewell. David cradled in Mrs. Abernathy's steady arms. The image burned itself into his memory, a tableau of what waited for them if they succeeded, what they stood to lose if they failed. Beside him, Eleanor sat straight in the saddle, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The wooden sparrow was tucked securely in her pocket, a talisman of hope and home. Together they rode toward Willow Creek, toward the past that had been stolen from them, and the future they were determined to reclaim. They traveled in silence for the first few miles, taking a winding path through pine-covered hills to avoid the main road. The day was clear and cold, their breath fogging in the air, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth. Jackson found himself watching Eleanor, marveling at the confidence with which she handled her mount. The Eleanor he had known had been comfortable on horseback, but not exceptional. This woman rode as if born to it, her body moving in perfect harmony with the animal beneath her. "You've become quite the horsewoman," he observed when they paused to water the animals at a small stream. Eleanor glanced up, a hint of surprise in her expression. "Necessity," she explained. "Wilson, my husband." She faltered over the word, then continued with determination. "He raised horses. When he discovered I could ride, he put me to work with them. Said it was better than having me underfoot in the house." The casual reference to her life in captivity still had the power to unsettle Jackson. He struggled to reconcile the strong woman before him with the horrors she must have endured. "I'm sorry," he said inadequately, "for all of it, for not finding you sooner." Eleanor's face softened slightly. "You thought I was dead, Jackson. You had no reason to look." "I should have known." The words escaped him before he could consider them. "Somehow I should have sensed you were still alive." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Is that why you never remarried? Because some part of you wasn't convinced I was gone?" The question caught him off guard. They had spoken little of the years they had spent apart, focusing instead on immediate concerns and future plans. "Partly," he admitted, "though I told myself it was because the life of a bounty hunter doesn't lend itself to family." He hesitated, then added, "There were women, nothing lasting." Eleanor nodded, accepting this without visible reaction. "And the bounty hunting, how did that come about? You were so committed to the law when we knew each other." Jackson gazed into the flowing water, memories surfacing like stones in a riverbed. "After the fire, after I thought you died, I became obsessed with finding who said it. The official investigation ruled it an accident, faulty wiring, they said. But I knew better. A building doesn't go up that fast without help." "So you investigated on your own?" "Yes, neglected my duties as deputy, got warnings, then got fired." He shrugged, the old bitterness rising. "Turned out the sheriff was in Blackwood's pocket, though I didn't know it then. When I kept pushing, asking questions, there was an incident." "What kind of incident?" Eleanor asked, her attention fully on him now. "The kind that ends with two men dead and a third me wanted for murder." Jackson's jaw tightened at the memory. "It was self-defense. They came for me in the night, said they had a message from someone who didn't appreciate my questions. I was faster on the draw." "Blackwood's men," Eleanor surmised. "Almost certainly, though I couldn't prove it. Had to leave town in a hurry. Spent 6 months running before I managed to clear my name. By then the bounty hunting seemed a natural fit. No boss to answer to, no politics to navigate. Just tracking bad men for money." Eleanor absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. "So we both lost our lives that night, just in different ways." The simple truth of this observation struck Jackson to the core. They had both been set adrift by the same event, both forced to become people they might never have chosen to be. "Yes," he acknowledged. "But maybe now we can find our way back, or forward at least." Eleanor's gaze met his, steady and clear. "Maybe we can." The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibilities neither was ready to voice. Then Eleanor turned back to her horse, checking the cinch with practiced hands. "We should keep moving," she said. "There's a lot of ground to cover before nightfall." Jackson nodded, recognizing the retreat to practicality for what it was, not rejection, but caution. They were both still feeling their way through this new relationship, this strange reunion of souls who knew each other intimately and not at all. They rode on, following Mrs. Abernathy's map along trails that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. By unspoken agreement, they avoided the main topics that hung between them: what would happen after they retrieved the evidence, what shape their future might take, whether the bond that had once united them could be rebuilt from the ashes of their past. Instead, they spoke of immediate concerns: the best route to take, where to camp for the night, what to do if they encountered Blackwood's men. The rhythm of practical planning was familiar. Comfortable, a way to connect without venturing into emotional territory neither was prepared to navigate. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they sought a sheltered place to make camp. A small clearing beneath an overhanging cliff offered protection from the wind and concealment from casual observation. They worked together with the efficiency of longtime partners, Jackson tending the horses, while Eleanor gathered firewood and cleared a space for their bedrolls. The domestic routine stirred memories in Jackson, memories of a time before the fire when they had planned camping trips and picnics, fantasizing about the life they would build together. Those plans had seemed so solid then, so inevitable. Now they existed only as ghosts haunting the edges of their interaction. As darkness fell and stars appeared overhead, they sat before a small, carefully banked fire, sharing a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and coffee. The warmth and food loosened something in Eleanor, or perhaps it was simply the distance from the children and the responsibilities they represented. "Tell me about your life," she said suddenly. "These past 5 years. Not just the bounty hunting, but were you happy? Did you find moments of joy?" The question was unexpected, revealing a generosity of spirit Jackson found humbling. Despite all she had endured, Eleanor still had the capacity to care about his experiences, to wonder about his happiness in the years she had suffered. "There were moments," he said honestly, "sunrises over the mountains, a good horse beneath me, the satisfaction of bringing a dangerous man to justice." He paused, considering. "But happy, no, not in any lasting way. There was always something missing, a hollow place I couldn't fill." Eleanor nodded, her gaze on the flames. "I understand that. Even with Lily, with the joy she brought me, there was always a space where you should have been. A phantom limb I could still feel even though it was gone." The metaphor was apt, describing precisely the sense of absence Jackson had lived with since her apparent death. "And now," he asked carefully, "is that space still there?" She looked up then, meeting his eyes across the fire. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything is happening so fast. Finding you again, running from Blackwood, planning for a future I never dared to imagine." She shook her head slightly. "It's overwhelming. I'm not sure what I feel beyond relief and fear and hope, maybe. A dangerous emotion for someone who's learned not to hope too much." The candor of her response touched Jackson deeply. She wasn't offering false reassurances or easy promises, but the truth as she understood it, complicated, uncertain, but honest. "I can wait," he said softly. "However long it takes for you to know what you want, whether that includes me or not." Eleanor's expression softened, a hint of the woman she had been showing through the careful composure she maintained. "Thank you for that," she said, "for understanding that I need time." "We have time now," Jackson assured her, though both knew the promise was tenuous at best. Blackwood's shadow still loomed over them, threatening the fragile new beginning they had found. They fell silent, then each lost in private thoughts, as the fire burned low and night deepened around them. When it came time to sleep, they arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, a respectful distance maintained. But as Jackson drifted towards sleep, he heard Eleanor's voice soft in the darkness. "Jackson, I'm glad it was you at the auction. I'm glad it was you who found us." The simple statement, offered like a gift across the dying embers, warmed him more than any fire could have. "So am I," he replied, "more than I can say." Sleep claimed them then beneath a canopy of stars that had witnessed their love in its first bloom and now watched over its fragile rebirth. Whatever tomorrow might bring, danger, discovery, the long-awaited retrieval of evidence, they faced it not as strangers, not quite as lovers, but as partners bound by a shared past and a future they were determined to reclaim. Together they slept, and for the first time in 5 years, neither was haunted by dreams of what they had lost. Dawn broke with cold clarity over the eastern mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rose. Jackson woke instantly, years of vigilance having trained him to transition from sleep to full alertness in a heartbeat. Eleanor was already up, tending the small fire with practiced efficiency, her movements quiet so as not to disturb him. "You should have woken me," he said, sitting up. "I could have taken the last watch." Eleanor glanced up, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Old habits, she replied. I've learned to function on little sleep. Another reminder of the years they'd spent apart, of the ways they had adapted to survive their separate hardships. Jackson rose, folding his bedroll with the automatic precision of a man who had lived most of his adult life on the trail. Coffee's nearly ready, Eleanor said, setting a battered pot at the edge of the flames. We should reach Willow Creek by midday if we maintain a good pace. Jackson nodded, studying the map Mrs. Abernathy had provided. There's a ridge here, he said, pointing to a line of hills just east of their destination. Good vantage point to observe the town before we go in. See if Blackwood's men are watching the place. They will be, Eleanor said with quiet certainty. He knows the evidence exists, knows I hid it somewhere. He just never figured out where. How did you manage that? Jackson asked, genuinely curious. To keep the location secret through everything. Eleanor's expression darkened momentarily, then cleared with deliberate control. Compartmentalization, she said simply. I put that knowledge in a place in my mind they couldn't reach, no matter what they did. The implication of what everything and what they did might encompass hung in the air between them. Jackson felt the familiar surge of rage toward Blackwood and his men, toward anyone who had hurt Eleanor during her captivity. But he kept his expression neutral, knowing that pity or anger would not help her now. You're the strongest person I've ever known, he said instead, the words inadequate but sincere. Eleanor met his gaze, something vulnerable flickering in her eyes before she looked away. Not strong, she countered, just stubborn, like someone else I know. The slight teasing note in her voice, so reminiscent of their interactions before the fire, caught Jackson off guard. For a moment, 5 years fell away, and they were simply Eleanor and Jackson planning an outing together. Then reality reasserted itself as Eleanor reached for her holstered revolver, checking the chambers with practiced hands. Another change, the Eleanor he had known had been uncomfortable around firearms, preferring words to weapons. Now she handled the gun with the familiarity of long use. Wilson taught me to shoot, she said, noticing his observation. One of the few useful things that came from that time. Jackson nodded, accepting this without comment. They had each been shaped by circumstance, forced to develop skills and defenses their younger selves would have found unimaginable. They broke camp efficiently, leaving minimal evidence of their presence. The horses rested and fed, seemed eager for the day's journey. As they rode out, Jackson found himself watching Eleanor's profile against the morning sky, the determined set of her jaw, the vigilant scan of her eyes across the terrain ahead. Beauty and strength in equal measure, tempered by suffering, but unbroken. The trail wound through increasingly familiar country as they approached Willow Creek. For Jackson, each landmark stirred memories, some pleasant, others painful. This was the land where he and Eleanor had fallen in love, where they had planned a future together, where everything had changed in the flames of a single night. Eleanor, too, seemed affected by the familiar surroundings, her posture gradually tensing as they drew closer to their destination. Whether from fear of what awaited them or the weight of returning to the scene of her abduction, Jackson couldn't tell. Are you all right? He asked as they paused to rest the horses near a stream they had once picnicked beside. Eleanor nodded, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the reins. Strange to be back, she admitted, like walking into a dream or a nightmare. This place exists in my memory as before everything changed. Jackson understood. For him as well, Willow Creek represented a dividing line, the place where his life had split into before and after the man he had been and the man he had become. We don't have to do this, he said, though he knew it wasn't true. We could find another way. Eleanor's gaze sharpened, the momentary vulnerability replaced by determination. No, she said firmly. The evidence is our best hope for stopping Blackwood permanently, for ensuring Lily and David grow up free from his shadow. She straightened in the saddle. Besides, I've dreamed of returning here for 5 years, not in fear, but in triumph. I won't let him take that from me, too. Her resolve steadied Jackson's own doubts. They would do this together and face whatever consequences came. As predicted, they reached the ridge overlooking Willow Creek by midday. From this vantage point, the town appeared much as Jackson remembered it, a cluster of buildings along a main street, the church steeple rising above the surrounding structures, the creek itself winding like a silver ribbon through the valley. Small but prosperous, sustained by the local cattle ranches and the railroad that had come through 3 years prior. Jackson surveyed the scene through his field glass, searching for any sign of Blackwood's men. Two riders at the south end of town, he reported, stationed where they can observe anyone approaching from the main road. Another man on the porch of the hotel trying to look casual, but watching the street too carefully. Eleanor nodded unsurprised. Any sign of Blackwood himself? Not that I can see, but that doesn't mean he isn't here. They watched for another hour, noting the patterns of the sentries, the quiet rhythm of the town. Finally, Jackson lowered the field glass. We'll approach from the north through the woods that run along the creek, he decided. There's less coverage there, but also fewer eyes watching. We can secure the evidence and be gone before they realize we were ever here. Eleanor agreed with the plan. They left the horses concealed in a stand of pines, continuing on foot through the afternoon shadows. The forest provided good cover, but the going was slow fallen logs and undergrowth impeding their progress. As they neared the edge of town, Eleanor paused, kneeling to retie her bootlace. But when she straightened, Jackson saw she was holding something small and wooden the sparrow Lily had carved for her. For luck, she said, noticing his gaze. She tucked the carving back into her pocket, close to her heart. Jackson nodded, touched by the gesture, and what it represented, not just Eleanor's love for their daughter, but her willingness to believe in luck, in hope, after everything she had endured. They skirted the outermost buildings, keeping to shadows and alleyways. Willow Creek was quiet in the late afternoon, most citizens attending to end-of-day chores or gathering at the saloon for early drinks. This worked to their advantage, allowing them to move relatively unnoticed toward their destination. There, Eleanor whispered, pointing to a massive oak that stood at the edge of a small park near the center of town. That's where I hid it. Jackson studied the tree and its surroundings. The oak was ancient, its trunk gnarled and massive, its branches spreading wide to create a natural canopy. It stood in plain sight, a landmark that had witnessed generations of Willow Creek's history. That's where I proposed to you, he realized, memory suddenly sharp and clear. Under that tree, the night of the Founders' Day dance, Eleanor nodded, her eyes softening momentarily. You remember. I remember everything about that night, Jackson admitted. The blue dress you wore, the way your hair was pinned up with those little pearl combs, how nervous I was fumbling the ring. A shadow of pain crossed Eleanor's face. I remember too, every detail. I held on to those memories when she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Never mind, that's not important now. But it was important, Jackson thought. Those memories had sustained her through her captivity, just as they had haunted him through his grief. They were part of the foundation upon which any future they might build would rest. We'll need a distraction, Eleanor said, returning to the practical matter at hand. The man watching from the hotel porch has a clear view of the oak. Jackson considered their options. There's the livery at the end of the street. If a few horses were to get loose, create some commotion. Perfect, Eleanor agreed. I'll retrieve the evidence while you create the distraction. Then we meet back at the creek crossing where we left the horses. Jackson frowned. I don't like the idea of separating. It's more efficient, Eleanor countered, and safer. If one of us is caught, the other can still complete the mission. Her expression softened slightly at his concern. I know where to look, Jackson. This is why we both came, so that if something happened to one of us, the other could still succeed. The logic was sound if cold. Jackson reluctantly agreed, though every instinct urged him to stay with her, to protect her as he had failed to do 5 years ago. They waited until dusk when shadows lengthened and visibility decreased. Then Jackson made his way to the livery, moving silently through back alleys and gardens. Eleanor positioned herself closer to the oak, waiting for the signal. The livery was quiet, the stable hand having stepped away for his dinner. Jackson slipped inside, finding half a dozen horses in the stalls. He selected three that looked spirited, quickly untying them and leading them toward the wide doors. A sharp whistle, a slap on their flanks, and the horses bolted into the street, nickering in alarm. Jackson ducked back into the shadows as shouts erupted. "Loose horses! Catch them!" And men ran from the saloon and nearby buildings to help corral the animals. In the confusion, Jackson saw Eleanor dart to the oak tree, dropping to her knees at its base. Her hands worked quickly, digging at a spot between two massive roots. Within moments, she had unearthed something, a small metal box, tarnished but intact. She tucked it into her jacket and moved away from the tree, keeping to the shadows as she headed toward their meeting point. So far, so good. Jackson began making his own way back, circling wide around the commotion in the main street. He had nearly reached the edge of town when a shout rang out behind him. "Hey, stop right there!" Jackson turned to see one of Blackwood's men, the sentry from the hotel porch pointing in his direction, a pistol already drawn. Whether the man had recognized him or simply spotted a suspicious figure slipping away, the result was the same. Cover blown. "Run!" Jackson shouted, hoping Eleanor was close enough to hear. He drew his own weapon, firing a warning shot that sent the sentry diving for cover. More shouts erupted as the town's sleepy evening dissolved into chaos. Jackson ran, dodging between buildings, heading for the creek and the relative safety of the forest beyond. Gunshots cracked behind him, bullets splintering wood near his head as he ducked and weaved. He reached the creek bank, plunging into the knee-deep water without hesitation. The cold shocked his system, but he pushed forward, making for the opposite shore where the trees offered better cover. More shots closer now. A bullet kicked up water near his leg. Another tore through his coat sleeve. He returned fire over his shoulder, not aiming to hit, but to discourage pursuit. Then he was across, scrambling up the muddy bank and into the protective embrace of the forest. He ran branches, whipping his face roots, threatening to trip him with every step. Behind him, he could hear the splash of pursuers entering the water. "Eleanor," he called, voice low but urgent. "Eleanor, where are you?" No answer came. Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs, not from exertion, but from fear. Had she made it out? Had she been captured? Wounded, he pushed deeper into the forest, following the route they had planned toward their horses. Every instinct screamed at him to go back to find Eleanor, but logic prevailed. If she had escaped, she would be heading for the rendezvous point. If she had been captured, well, he would be no use to her, dead or captured himself. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded behind him. Either he had lost them in the darkness, or they had given up the chase to focus on searching the town. Either way, it gave him the opportunity he needed to reach the hidden clearing where they had left their mounts. Relief washed through him as he spotted a figure already there, untying the horses in preparation for a quick departure. "Eleanor," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, her face pale in the gathering darkness, but her eyes alert. "Jackson, are you hurt?" "No, close calls, but nothing serious." He moved to help her with the horses. "You got the evidence?" In answer, she patted her jacket where the metal box created a rectangular bulge. "Just where I left it 5 years ago. Now let's get out of here before they think to search the northern woods." They mounted quickly, urging the horses into a ground-eating trot that would put distance between them and Willow Creek without exhausting the animals. Only when they were several miles away, following a little-used trail through the mountains, did they slow to a more sustainable pace. "Let me see it," Jackson said, curiosity finally overcoming practicality. Eleanor reached into her jacket, withdrawing the metal box. It was smaller than Jackson had expected, no larger than a deck of cards, but heavily constructed of what appeared to be iron, with a simple clasp holding it closed. "I fashioned it from a cash box in the school where I taught," Eleanor explained, handing it to him. "Small enough to hide easily, sturdy enough to protect the contents from the elements." Jackson opened the clasp, lifting the lid carefully. Inside, protected by oilcloth, was a stack of papers, some official documents bearing seals and signatures, others handwritten notes in what he recognized as Eleanor's neat script. Bank records, Eleanor said, watching as he examined the contents, showing payments from Blackwood to various officials, judges, sheriffs, mayors. Lists of shipments, women, and sometimes children trafficked through his network. Dates, names, amounts. And my own testimony written the night before the fire, detailing everything I had seen and heard while working for Judge Patterson. Jackson leafed through the papers with growing amazement. This was indeed enough to destroy Blackwood, not just to have him arrested, but to dismantle his entire operation and expose the corrupt officials who had protected him. "How did you get all this?" he asked, awed by the thoroughness of the evidence. "I was Judge Patterson's secretary," Eleanor reminded him. "I had access to his files, his correspondence. When I began to suspect something wasn't right, payments that didn't match official records, meetings that were never recorded, I started making copies. At first, just to protect myself in case I was ever accused of impropriety. Then, as I realized the scope of what was happening, to create a record of the truth. And Blackwood discovered what you were doing." Eleanor nodded, her expression grim. "Someone in the judge's office must have reported my interest in certain files. I never found out who. But 2 days before the fire, Judge Patterson called me into his office. He seemed nervous, agitated. He told me to forget anything unusual I might have seen, that it would be better for everyone, especially those I cared about." Her eyes met Jackson's. "He mentioned you specifically. Said it would be a shame if anything happened to a promising young deputy with his whole life ahead of him." The threat, even 5 years removed, sent a chill through Jackson. "So you hid the evidence." "That night, I knew I had to get it somewhere safe, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. The oak tree seemed perfect, our special place, but also a public landmark where I could access the evidence if needed without drawing suspicion." "But you never got the chance, no?" Eleanor's voice grew distant, her gaze fixed on some point in the past. "The next night was the fire. They took me from my room just after midnight. I remember the smell of smoke, thinking the building was actually burning with people inside. Later I learned the fire was set after they had removed me to cover my disappearance." Jackson replaced the papers in the box, securing the clasp before handing it back to Eleanor. "This changes everything," he said. "With this evidence, we can go directly to the federal marshal in Denver. Blackwood's local influence won't matter." Eleanor tucked the box away, again, her expression resolute. "Then that's our next destination. The sooner this evidence is in official hands, the sooner Lily and David will be truly safe." They rode on through the night, pushing the horses as much as they dared, taking turns dozing in the saddle during the quietest stretches. By dawn, they had covered significant ground following Mrs. Abernathy's map, along trails that kept them well away from main roads and potential encounters with Blackwood's men. As the sun rose, they paused to rest the horses near a small spring. Eleanor splashed cold water on her face, the action revealing dark circles beneath her eyes, evidence of the strain of their journey and the emotional toll of returning to Willow Creek. "You should rest," Jackson said, concern overriding practicality. "We've made good time. An hour's sleep won't significantly delay us." Eleanor shook her head, though her exhaustion was evident. "I'll rest when this is finished, when I know Lily and David are safe." She straightened, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "Besides, we don't know how quickly news of our presence in Willow Creek will reach Blackwood. He could already be mobilizing to intercept us." The possibility was all too real. Jackson didn't press the issue, recognizing the same stubborn determination that had kept Eleanor alive through 5 years of captivity. Instead, he focused on the immediate needs, refilling their canteens, checking the horses for signs of strain, plotting their route for the day ahead. They were preparing to depart when Eleanor suddenly stilled, head tilted as if listening. "Riders," she said, voice low with tension, "coming fast." Jackson heard it then too, the distant thunder of hooves, multiple horses being pushed hard. Without discussion, they led their own mounts into a thicket of pine and undergrowth, concealing themselves just as a group of horsemen came into view on the trail below. 5 men heavily armed riding with purpose. At their head was a figure Jackson recognized immediately, though they had not crossed paths in years. Marcus Blackwood himself. Even from a distance, Blackwood's commanding presence was evident. Tall and broad-shouldered despite his 60-odd years, with silver-streaked dark hair, and the bearing of a man accustomed to unquestioning obedience. He rode slightly ahead of his men, scanning the terrain with the sharp eyes of a predator. Beside Jackson, Eleanor had gone rigid, her breathing shallow, one hand pressed against her mouth, as if to physically prevent any sound from escaping. The reaction spoke volumes about the terror Blackwood had instilled in her during her captivity. Jackson placed a steadying hand on her arm, a silent reminder that she was not alone this time. She nodded almost imperceptibly, composing herself with visible effort. They remained motionless as the riders passed below, heading in the direction of Willow Creek. Only when the sound of hooves had faded completely did they emerge from their hiding place. "He knows," Eleanor said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "He must have received word about the disturbance in Willow Creek, guessed what we were after. Which means he may also guess where we're headed," Jackson concluded grimly. "We need to change our route, find a way to Denver that he won't anticipate." Eleanor studied Mrs. Abernathy's map, tracing potential paths with her finger. "Here," she said, finally indicating a thin line that wound through particularly rugged terrain. "It's longer, but it cuts through the high country where there are few established trails. He'll expect us to take the more direct route through Pine Ridge." Jackson examined the proposed path, weighing the difficulties against the advantages. "It's rough country," he warned, "especially with tired horses. But you're right, it's less predictable." The decision made, they mounted and set off again, angling away from their original route toward the forbidding peaks that marked the beginning of the high country. The going was slow and difficult, steep slopes, loose rock, narrow trails that sometimes disappeared entirely, forcing them to navigate by instinct in the rough map. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the air grew noticeably thinner, the temperature dropping despite the sun's brightness. The horses labored on the steep inclines, forcing frequent stops to rest. During one such pause, as they stood on a rocky outcropping that offered a view of the valley below, Eleanor broke the silence that had persisted since their encounter with Blackwood. "I used to dream of killing him," she said abruptly, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, "especially in the early days of my captivity. I would imagine different ways, poison in his wine, a knife while he slept, pushing him from his horse during one of the inspection rides." Her voice was detached, almost clinical. "It kept me sane, I think. Gave me something to hold on to when everything else was taken away." Jackson listened without interruption, understanding the confession for what it was, not a request for advice or absolution, but the sharing of a truth long held private. "What stopped you?" he asked finally. "It sounds like you had opportunities." Eleanor glanced at him, perhaps surprised by the lack of judgment in his tone. "Lily," she said simply. "At first the pregnancy itself made any escape attempt too risky. Then after she was born, I couldn't leave her, and I couldn't take her with me if I acted against Blackwood. He made sure I understood that she would suffer for any resistance on my part." Jackson nodded, a fresh wave of hatred for Blackwood washing through him. The man had used Eleanor's child, their child, as a hostage to ensure compliance. "And later," he prompted gently, "later I realized that killing him would solve nothing," Eleanor continued. "His operation was too extensive, too well established. Someone else would simply take his place, and Lily and I would still be trapped. Or worse." She shook her head. "No, the only real freedom would come from destroying the entire system, exposing the corruption, the trafficking, all of it. That's why the evidence was so important. It's the only way to ensure he can never hurt anyone again." The wisdom and foresight in this assessment impressed Jackson anew. Even in the depths of captivity and despair, Eleanor had maintained a clear-eyed view of her situation and the larger context that created it. "You're extraordinary," he said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Most people would have broken under what you endured, but you kept fighting, kept planning, kept protecting Lily. Eleanor met his gaze, then something vulnerable flickering in her eyes. I had help, she admitted softly. Memories of you, of us, of the life we had planned together. It gave me something to hold on to, a reminder that there had been goodness and love in the world, even if I couldn't access it anymore. The confession, so simple, so profound, struck Jackson to the core. While he had been drowning his grief in whiskey and the mindless pursuit of bounties, the memory of their love had been sustaining Eleanor through unimaginable hardship. Before he could respond, a distant sound caught their attention, the faint echo of horses' hooves on stone. They found our trail, Eleanor said, tension returning to her voice. We need to move. Jackson nodded, helping her remount despite the protest of weary muscles. They pushed on higher into the mountains, following game trails and dry creek beds, anything to obscure their path and throw off pursuit. The afternoon waned, shadows lengthening as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. The temperature dropped further, a cold wind picking up that carried the promise of frost by nightfall. We need to find shelter, Jackson said as they paused to rest the increasingly labored horses. Somewhere defensible where we can see them coming. Eleanor nodded, scanning their surroundings with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating terrain for threats. There, she said, pointing to a rocky formation about half a mile ahead. Looks like it might offer some cover. They approached cautiously, discovering what appeared to be an abandoned miners' camp tucked into a natural alcove in the rock face. A crude lean-to provided minimal shelter, and the remains of a fire pit suggested the place had been used within the past few months, though it was currently deserted. Not ideal, Jackson assessed, but better than being caught in the open. At least we'll have our backs protected and a clear view of the approach. They set about making the best of the situation, securing the horses in a sheltered spot, gathering what meager firewood they could find, arranging their supplies for quick access if they needed to flee again. Jackson cleared a firing position that would give him a good view of the trail below, while offering some protection from return fire. As darkness fell, they permitted themselves a small fire shielded from distant observation by the rock formation. They ate sparingly from their dwindling supplies, both aware that the pursuit had complicated their timeline. We should reach the main road to Denver by tomorrow evening if we push hard, Jackson said, studying the map by firelight. From there, it's another day's ride to the city. Eleanor nodded, her expression distant as she stared into the flames. If we make it that far. The bleak assessment hung between them, neither willing to voice the obvious. Blackwood and his men were close behind, better rested, more familiar with the territory. The odds of reaching Denver without a confrontation were slim at best. We will, Jackson said with more confidence than he felt. We've come too far to fail now. Eleanor looked up, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Always the optimist, she said, a note of affection in her voice that warmed Jackson more than the fire. One of us has to be, he replied, matching her tone. The moment of connection, fragile but real, was broken by a sound from below, the distant crack of a branch, the soft whinny of a horse. They extinguished the fire immediately, moving to the defensive positions they had prepared. Jackson peered into the darkness, his experienced eyes picking out movement on the trail below, the darker shapes of riders against the night sky, moving with deliberate stealth. They found us, he whispered, though the words were unnecessary. Eleanor was already checking her revolver, her movements precise despite the tension evident in her posture. How many? She asked, voice steady. At least 4, maybe more. Jackson assessed their options quickly. They'll wait for dawn to make their move. Better visibility, less chance of us slipping away in the dark. So we don't wait, Eleanor concluded. We move now while we still have the advantage of darkness. The plan was risky, but sound. Blackwood's men would expect them to stay put to defend their position. Moving out now, slipping past the perimeter they were undoubtedly establishing, offered their best chance of escape. They gathered their essential supplies in silence, leaving behind anything that would slow them down. The horses were a problem too noisy for a stealthy departure, but necessary if they were to outrun pursuit once discovered. We lead them on foot until we're clear, Jackson decided, then mount and make a run for it. Eleanor nodded agreement. They moved out cautiously, staying low, using the rocky terrain for cover. The horses followed with surprising docility, perhaps sensing the need for quiet. They had nearly reached the edge of the small plateau when disaster struck. Eleanor's horse, tired and nervous, stepped on loose shale, sending a cascade of small rocks clattering down the slope. The night erupted with shouts and gunfire. "There they are, up on the ridge. Don't let them escape." "Run," Jackson urged, abandoning stealth for speed. They mounted quickly, spurring the horses down the far side of the plateau away from the main concentration of pursuers. Bullets whined past them, striking rock and earth, but missing their moving targets in the darkness. Jackson returned fire, not aiming to hit, but to discourage close pursuit, to buy them precious seconds of distance. They rode hard, following a deer trail that wound downward through scrub and scattered pines. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew, men shouting, horses crashing through underbrush, the occasional crack of a rifle. The trail widened, opening onto a broader path that offered better footing but less cover. They pushed the horses to a gallop, racing against the coming dawn that would make them easy targets. A shot rang out closer than the others. Eleanor's horse screamed, stumbling before regaining its footing. "They're gaining," she called, urging her wounded mount forward with desperate determination. Jackson glanced back, seeing shapes emerging from the darkness behind them, three riders closing the gap with alarming speed. One was clearly Blackwood, his larger silhouette unmistakable, even in the pre-dawn gloom. "There's a fork ahead," Jackson shouted. "When I say now, take the left path, I'll hold them off." "No," Eleanor protested. "We stay together." "There's no time to argue. The evidence is what matters. Get it to Denver." Jackson drew his rifle from its scabbard, preparing to make a stand. "Now, Eleanor, go." The fork appeared before them, the left path dipping down toward what appeared to be a creek bed, the right continuing along the ridge. Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned her horse left with a cry of frustration and fear. Jackson wheeled his mount, taking position behind a large boulder that overlooked the approach. He dismounted, slapping the horse's flank to send it running after Eleanor, a precaution in case he needed to make a quick escape and a way to confuse their pursuers. He didn't have to wait long. The three riders appeared within minutes, slowing as they approached the fork in the trail. Blackwood raised a hand, signaling his men to halt. "Harlow," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "I know you're there. Show yourself." Jackson remained silent, rifle steady against his shoulder sights, aligned on Blackwood's chest. "You're outnumbered and outgunned," Blackwood continued, "but I'm a reasonable man. All I want is what the woman took from Willow Creek. Give me that and you both can go free. You have my word." The empty promise might have been laughable if the situation weren't so dire. Jackson had no illusions about Blackwood's intentions. If he got his hands on the evidence and on Eleanor, neither of them would live to see another sunrise. Still engaging in conversation served a purpose. Every moment Blackwood spent trying to negotiate was another moment Eleanor had to put distance between herself and danger. "Your word isn't worth much, Blackwood," Jackson called back, shifting positions slightly to make himself a harder target. "Not after what you did to Eleanor, to all those women." "Business," Blackwood replied dismissively. "Nothing personal. Until you got involved, of course. You were always a problem, Harlow. Too honest for your own good, too stubborn to take a hint when it was offered. Is that what you call it? Setting fire to a boarding house? Kidnapping an innocent woman? A hint." Blackwood chuckled, the sound chilling in its casual cruelty. "She wasn't so innocent. Sticking her nose where it didn't belong, copying documents, asking questions. She made herself a threat to my operation. And threats must be eliminated." He paused. "Though I'll admit keeping her alive was a miscalculation. Sentiment. I thought she might be useful as leverage if you ever became too troublesome. The admission confirmed what Jackson had suspected, that Eleanor's abduction had been as much about him as about the evidence she had gathered. The realization only fueled his determination to end Blackwood's reign of terror once and for all. Enough talk, Blackwood said, his tone hardening. Where is she, Harlow? Where's my property? The possessive claim ignited something primal in Jackson. She was never your property, he growled, and she's beyond your reach now. We'll see about that. Blackwood signaled to his men, who began to spread out clearly, intending to flank Jackson's position. Time for talking was over. Jackson fired the shot deliberately high, striking the branch above Blackwood's head. The men scattered, taking cover behind trees and rocks. Jackson used the moment to retreat, moving quickly from boulder to boulder, working his way down toward the creek bed where Eleanor had gone. Gunfire erupted behind him as Blackwood's men realized his strategy, bullets whining off stone and splintering wood. He returned fire, sparingly conserving ammunition, focusing on keeping them pinned down rather than hitting them. His goal was delay, not confrontation. Every minute he could slow them increased Eleanor's chances of escape. The path dropped steeply, becoming more of a controlled slide than a descent. Jackson half ran, half skidded down the slope, using trees and rocks for balance. The creek appeared below, not the gentle stream he had expected, but a swift churning river swollen with snowmelt from the mountains. And there at the water's edge was Eleanor. Not fleeing as he had ordered, but waiting, her horse tethered to a nearby tree, his own mount beside it. What are you doing? He demanded as he reached her. You should be halfway to Denver by now. I couldn't leave you, she said simply. Not again. Not ever again. The declaration, delivered without drama, but with absolute conviction, struck Jackson speechless. Before he could respond, gunfire erupted from the slope above. Blackwood's men had spotted them. We need to cross, Eleanor said, already untying the horses. There's a ford just upstream. They mounted quickly, riding along the bank until they reached a section where the river widened and shallow, allowing for a crossing. The water was ice cold and fast-moving, reaching the horses' bellies at the deepest point. They struggled across the animals, fighting the current with every step. Shots continued from the far bank, most falling short or wide in the poor light. But one found its mark. Jackson felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his upper arm, tearing through jacket and flesh with equal ease. Then they were across, urging the exhausted horses up the opposite bank and into the cover of the trees beyond. Behind them, they could hear Blackwood shouting orders, directing his men to find another crossing point. You're hit, Eleanor said as they paused to catch their breath, her eyes fixed on the spreading bloodstain on Jackson's sleeve. Just a graze, he assured her, though the pain suggested it might be more serious than he was admitting. We need to keep moving. They'll find a way across eventually. Eleanor nodded, tearing a strip from her shirt to bind the wound hastily. There's a settlement about 5 miles ahead, she said, consulting the map. Cedar Ridge. Small, but there's a telegraph office. We can send word to the federal marshal in Denver, let them know we're coming with evidence against Blackwood. The plan was sound. If the federal authorities were alerted to the situation, Blackwood's local influence would be neutralized. Even he wouldn't dare attack them openly if the law was already involved. They rode on, pushing their exhausted mounts as much as they dared. The sun was fully up now, turning the landscape into a panorama of gold and green. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Cedar Ridge appeared in the distance, a small cluster of buildings nestled in a valley, smoke rising from morning fires. Safety, at least temporarily. A chance to rest, to tend wounds, to alert the authorities to their situation. They were less than a mile from the settlement when the ambush struck. Riders emerged from a stand of pines ahead, cutting off their approach to Cedar Ridge. More appeared behind them, closing the trap. How? Eleanor began, shock evident in her voice. He must have had men already in the area, Jackson realized grimly, positioned to intercept us if we tried for Cedar Ridge. They wheeled their horses looking for an escape route, but Blackwood's men had chosen their position well. They were surrounded the only open path leading away from the settlement back into the wilderness where pursuit would eventually run them to ground. What do we do? Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the dire situation. Jackson assessed their options quickly. Fighting would be suicide. They were outnumbered at least 5-1. Surrender meant death or worse for both of them. The only choice was to run to find somewhere to make a stand where the odds weren't quite so overwhelming. This way, he decided, pointing to a narrow ravine that offered their only chance of breaking through the encirclement. Stay close to me. They spurred their tired horses forward, racing for the gap. Gunfire erupted around them, bullets kicking up dust and stone. Jackson returned fire, emptying his revolver at their pursuers, forcing them to take cover momentarily. They reached the ravine, the horses' hooves sliding on loose shale as they navigated the steep walls. The path narrowed further, barely wide enough for a single rider, forcing them into single file with Jackson in the lead. The ravine twisted and turned, eventually opening onto a broader valley. But any hope of escape was dashed as they emerged to find more of Blackwood's men waiting, rifles ready. At their center, mounted on a massive black horse, was Blackwood himself. His expression was one of satisfaction, tinged with cruelty, the look of a predator who had run his prey to ground. "End of the line, Harlow," he called. "You've led us on quite a chase, but it's over now." Jackson and Eleanor reined in their blowing horses, trapped between the men behind and those ahead. Jackson's mind raced, searching for options, for any way out of the deadly situation. "Give me the evidence," Blackwood continued, addressing Eleanor directly now. "And perhaps I'll consider allowing your children to live. The girl is mine by right, after all, raised in my house. And the boy, well, he has his uses." The threat against Lily and David struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Her face paled, but her voice remained steady as she replied, "You'll never touch them again. Never." Blackwood smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "Bold words from someone in your position, my dear. But then you always were stubborn. It made breaking you so much more satisfying." Jackson felt rage building within him, hot and dangerous. The casual cruelty, the reminder of what Eleanor had endured at this man's hands. It took every ounce of self-control not to charge forward, to end Blackwood's life, even at the cost of his own. But that would leave Eleanor alone, surrounded by enemies. He forced himself to remain still, to think rather than react. "What's it to be then?" Blackwood asked, his patience visibly thinning. "The evidence in exchange for your lives, or shall we do this the hard way?" Eleanor straightened in her saddle, chin lifting in a gesture of defiance that struck Jackson with its familiarity, the same determination he had fallen in love with years ago, undimmed by all she had suffered. "There's a third option," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "Justice Ishawishimo." Before Blackwood could respond, the stillness of the morning was shattered by gunfire, not from his men, but from the ridge above the valley. Riders appeared silhouetted against the sky, firing with precision at Blackwood's forces. "Federal marshals," someone shouted. "It's a trap." Confusion erupted among Blackwood's men, some returning fire, others breaking formation in panic. Blackwood himself remained calm, his gaze fixed on Eleanor and Jackson with murderous intensity. "You planned this," he said, realization dawning. "Somehow you got word to them." "Mrs. Abernathy." Eleanor explained, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "She sent the telegraph as soon as we left her farm. Told the federal marshal everything about you, about the evidence, about where we were heading. They've been tracking us, waiting for the right moment to intervene." The revelation stunned Jackson as much as it did Blackwood. Eleanor had anticipated this possibility, had made arrangements without telling him, a precaution in case they were separated, in case one of them was captured or killed. Blackwood's expression contorted with rage. "You think this changes anything? You think a few marshals can stop me? I own judges, politicians. I'll be free within days, and then I'll find you. Find your precious children. Make you all wish for death." With that, he drew his pistol, aiming not at Jackson but at Eleanor, a final act of vengeance against the woman who had defied him, who had orchestrated his downfall. Jackson reacted without thought, spurring his horse forward, placing himself between Eleanor and the weapon. The shot rang out, pain blossoming in his chest as the bullet found its mark. He heard Eleanor's scream, felt himself falling, the world tilting sideways as he slid from the saddle. The ground rose to meet him with bone-jarring force, more gunfire shouting the thunder of hooves. Through a haze of pain, Jackson saw Eleanor leap from her horse, rushing to his side, hands pressing against the wound in a desperate attempt to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me," she was saying, her voice breaking. "Jackson, please, stay with me." He tried to respond to tell her it would be all right, but no words came. Darkness was encroaching at the edges of his vision, the pain receding into a strange floating numbness. The last thing he saw was Eleanor's face above him, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, her lips forming words he could no longer hear. And behind her, a figure falling from a black horse, Blackwood struck by a marshal's bullet, toppling to the ground with the finality of justice long delayed. Then darkness claimed him, and Jackson Harlow knew no more. The world returned in fragments, pain voices, the smell of antiseptic, the rustle of fabric. Jackson surfaced from unconsciousness slowly, each awakening, lasting a little longer, bringing a little more clarity. He was in a bed, not on the ground, a room with white walls and curtained windows. A hospital in Denver he eventually pieced together from overheard conversations. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, had collapsed, a lung had nearly killed him. But he was alive, healing, though the process would be long. And always when he woke, Eleanor was there. Sometimes sitting quietly by his bed, reading or sewing. Sometimes speaking in low tones with doctors or nurses. Sometimes simply holding his hand, her head bowed as if in prayer. On the third day, or was it the fourth, Jackson woke to find her dozing in a chair beside his bed, exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes, the slump of her shoulders. Even in sleep, and one of her hands remained outstretched, resting lightly on his arm as if to reassure herself of his continued presence. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. She woke instantly, years of vigilance having trained her to transition from sleep to alertness in a heartbeat. "Jackson," she breathed, relief flooding her features. "You're awake, truly awake this time." "How long?" he asked, the simple question requiring significant effort. "Nearly a week," she told him, reaching for a glass of water and helping him drink. "The doctor wasn't sure but I knew you would. You promised Lily you'd bring me home safe. You wouldn't break that promise." The mention of Lily sent a jolt of concern through Jackson. "The children?" "Safe," Eleanor assured him. "Still with Mrs. Abernathy. She's been bringing them to visit every other day. Lily's been reading to you, though you probably don't remember." He didn't, though the knowledge warmed him nonetheless. Blackwood Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Dead, shot by Marshal Hollister during the confrontation. Most of his men were captured, though a few escaped in the confusion. The evidence? In the right hands. Judge Patterson has been arrested along with 3 sheriffs and a county commissioner. More to follow, they say, as the investigation continues." Eleanor's hand tightened on his. "It's over, Jackson. Really over. We're free." The simple statement, "we're free," held such weight, such significance after 5 years of captivity for Eleanor, of grief and aimless wandering for Jackson. Free to live, to love, to build the future that had been stolen from them. And now, he asked the question encompassing far more than immediate plans. Eleanor seemed to understand the broader inquiry. She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "Now we heal," she said finally, "all of us. And then we see what's possible. Not a promise, not yet, but an opening, a willingness to consider a shared future that Jackson hadn't dared to hope for in the midst of their desperate flight from Blackwood." "I'd like that," he said simply. Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face, allowing a glimpse of the woman she had been before the fire, before the years of captivity. So would I. The quiet moment was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway, a child's voice high and excited, followed by Mrs. Abernathy's deeper tones attempting to impose restraint. "That'll be Lily," Eleanor said, her smile widening. "She's been impossible since they told her you were improving. Insisted on bringing something to show you." The door burst open, admitting a whirlwind of energy in the form of Lily, her face alight with joy at seeing Jackson awake. Behind her came Mrs. Abernathy carrying David, who had grown noticeably in the weeks since Jackson had last seen him. "Father!" Lily exclaimed, rushing to the bedside. "You're awake! I knew you would be today. I told Mrs. Abernathy we had to come." Jackson found himself smiling despite the pain that accompanied the movement. "Hello, Lilyflower," he greeted her, using the endearment that had come so naturally during their brief time together. She beamed at him, then remembered her purpose. "I made you something," she announced, holding out a small wooden carving similar to the sparrow she had made for Eleanor. Mrs. Abernathy helped with the sharp parts again. Jackson accepted the offering, examining it with appropriate seriousness. It was a horse, crude but recognizable, its legs splayed as if in mid-gallop. "It's beautiful," he told her sincerely. "Thank you." Lily nodded, satisfied with his response. "It's to remind you of how brave you were," she explained. "Mrs. Abernathy told me what happened, how you saved Mama from the bad man." Jackson glanced at Eleanor, wondering how much the child had been told about the confrontation with Blackwood. Eleanor's slight shake of her head confirmed his suspicion. Lily knew only a sanitized version of events. "Your mama saved me too," he said, wanting Lily to understand this essential truth. "We saved each other." This seemed to please Lily even more. "That's what families do," she stated with the absolute conviction of childhood. "They save each other." Out of the mouths of babes, Jackson thought, meeting Eleanor's gaze over their daughter's head. In those simple words, Lily had articulated what had taken them years of separation and suffering to fully understand. Mrs. Abernathy approached the bed David balanced on her hip. "Someone else wanted to say hello," she said, her usual gruff manner softened by the circumstances. Eleanor reached for her son, cradling him close as she had done countless times during their journey. But instead of keeping him, she surprised Jackson by gently placing the boy on the bed beside him. David regarded Jackson solemnly for a moment, then reached out with one small hand to pat his bearded cheek. The gesture, so innocent and trusting, brought an unexpected lump to Jackson's throat. This child, born of violence and captivity, knew nothing of the circumstances of his conception. He knew only that these people around him offered safety, comfort, love. And in that moment, Jackson made a silent vow to ensure David never learned differently, never felt himself less worthy of that love because of his parentage. "Hello, little man," he said softly, earning a gummy smile in response. The moment expanded, encompassing the five of them in a circle of connection that transcended blood and circumstance. A family forged not through traditional means, but through shared hardship, mutual protection, and the deliberate choice to love despite or perhaps because of all they had endured. Outside the hospital window, Denver continued its bustling life carriages, passing pedestrians, hurrying about their business, the newly laid railroad tracks gleaming in the distance. A world of possibilities stretching before them, no longer constrained by the shadow of Marcus Blackwood. Eleanor's hand found Jackson's, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they had never been parted. Lily leaned against her mother, one small hand resting on David's back. Mrs. Abernathy stood watch over them all, a guardian who had found her own measure of peace in helping to bring Blackwood's operation to justice. In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by those who had fought alongside him, Jackson Harlow finally allowed himself to believe in a future he had thought forever lost, a future built not on the ashes of what had been, but on the foundation of who they had become. And in that belief, he found not just hope, but certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A family bound by choice, by sacrifice, by love that had survived the unimaginable, a love reborn from the ashes stronger for having been tested in fire.